Welcome to the Midnight Echoes. Before we dive into tonight's stories, I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see where our viewers are tuning in from. If you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, unwind, and prepare for tonight's eerie adventures. I had been house-sitting for a couple of days when things started to get weird. The mansion was massive, old and gothic, with creaking floors and dark corners that seemed to whisper secrets. At first, I shrugged off the noises as part of the mansion's charm. But that night, as I sat reading in the dimly lit study, the eeriest sound crept up behind me. Faint footsteps. My heart pounded as I turned around, but there was nothing there. It wasn't long before the footsteps returned, this time louder and closer. I froze, hoping it was my imagination playing tricks on me. But when the sound of creaking floorboards echoed from upstairs, I knew someone, or something, was in the mansion with me. Chilling dread filled the room. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but there was no signal in this isolated place. Gathering my courage, I decided to investigate. I crept upstairs, the eerie silence making every step feel like a countdown. As I reached the landing, a masked figure emerged from one of the dark rooms. My blood turned cold. Before I could react, the figure lunged at me with a knife. I barely dodged, scrambling backward as my mind raced for an escape plan. The only option was the window. Without thinking, I hurled myself through the second-story window, landing hard on the overgrown grass below. Pain shot through my body, but adrenaline kept me moving. I ran as fast as I could, never looking back, the haunting figure's presence still burning in my mind. The mansion seemed alive, pulling me deeper into its dark history as I escaped into the night. It wasn't until the next day, when I spoke with the police, that I learned the mansion's dark secret. Decades of unsolved murders had occurred within those very walls. Each victim had vanished without a trace, and the masked figure I encountered was never caught. The mansion was haunted, not by ghosts, but by a chilling evil that thrived on fear. Even now, the memory of that night haunts me. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, I can still hear those footsteps drawing nearer, as if they're waiting for me to return. But one thing is clear: I will never set foot in that mansion again. The eerie silence, the haunting presence, it's all too much to bear. There are places in this world that should be left alone, and that mansion is one of them. The police never found the masked intruder, and part of me wonders if they ever will. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. That night in the mansion, I came face to face with something truly terrifying. It wasn't just a person, it was the embodiment of pure, chilling evil. And it still lingers, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor. I don't know who or what was behind the mask, but I know I barely escaped with my life. Every so often, I think about what would have happened if I hadn't jumped. The thought sends a shiver down my spine. That place, that cursed mansion, will always be a part of me now, a haunting memory that I can never escape. The darkness that surrounded me that night is something I can't fully explain. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, more primal. It was as if the mansion itself wanted me gone, wanted me to become another one of its unsolved mysteries. And who knows, maybe I would have, if I hadn't gotten out when I did. There are some places that carry a kind of energy, something that gets under your skin and stays with you. The mansion is one of those places. It's not just haunted by the past, it's haunted by something alive, something chilling, something that thrives on the fear of those who dare to enter. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, just the two of us camping deep in the woods. The first couple of days were perfect: clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the sound of nature all around us. We set up our tent by a small stream, far away from anyone else, or so we thought. On the third night, as we sat by the campfire, the woods grew unnervingly quiet. No wind, no birds, no insects. Just an eerie stillness that sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at my partner, and we both knew something wasn't right. That's when we heard it, the faint snap of a twig, followed by hushed whispers. It was too dark to see beyond the flickering light of the fire, but I could feel eyes on us, watching. My heart raced as I scanned the trees, but nothing moved. Just as I was about to brush it off as my imagination, a voice cut through the silence. "Get up now." It wasn't a request, it was a command. I turned slowly to see a group of armed strangers stepping out from the shadows. There were 4 of them, rifles slung over their shoulders, faces obscured by hoods. One of them pointed his weapon at us, motioning for us to stand. My partner and I exchanged a terrified glance, but did as we were told. "We don't want trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The leader of the group just laughed, a low, chilling sound. "Too late for that," he muttered. Before we could react, they moved in closer, surrounding us. Panic set in. Without warning, one of them grabbed my partner by the arm, yanking him toward the woods. I screamed, but it was cut short by the sharp click of a gun being cocked. They wanted us to run, to give them the thrill of a chase. I grabbed my partner's hand, and we bolted into the forest, branches whipping at our faces as we ran for our lives. Behind us, the sound of gunfire cracked through the trees, the bullets whizzing past us, too close for comfort. We ran blindly through the darkness, the fear pounding in my chest louder than my footsteps. The terrain was rough, uneven, and at any moment I expected one of us to trip and fall. But we couldn't stop. The armed strangers were right behind us, their shouts and gunshots echoing through the woods. We reached the edge of a ravine, a deep drop with no easy way across. I hesitated for a split second, but then I saw it. The flash of light from one of their flashlights closing in. "Jump!" I yelled, and without thinking we leaped over the ravine, barely making it to the other side. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting up my legs, but I scrambled to my feet, pulling my partner with me. The sound of footsteps slowed, then stopped. They hadn't followed us across. For the first time since the chase began, I allowed myself to breathe. But we weren't safe yet. We kept moving, putting as much distance between us and our pursuers as possible. Every noise in the forest made me flinch, and the darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides. We stumbled through the woods for what felt like hours until finally the faint glow of dawn began to break through the trees. Exhausted and terrified, we collapsed by a large rock, too tired to go any further. That's when we heard it, the distant roar of an engine. A ranger's jeep appeared through the trees, and I waved frantically, desperate for help. The ranger jumped out, eyes wide with concern as we told him what had happened. He radioed for backup immediately, but by the time the police arrived, the armed strangers were long gone. They left no trace, no footprints, no signs they were ever there. Even now, I can still feel the fear from that night, the cold terror of being hunted like prey. We never did find out who those people were or why they attacked us. The police said they might have been part of a local militia, or maybe something worse. All I know is we were lucky to escape with our lives. The woods may seem peaceful, but there's something haunting about the silence, something chilling lurking just beyond the trees. We haven't been camping since. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in those woods, running, hearing the gunshots behind me, waiting for the moment when we wouldn't be fast enough. The forest that once seemed so peaceful now feels like a trap, a place where darkness hides in plain sight. The eerie stillness that fell that night will forever be etched into my memory, a haunting reminder of how quickly peace can turn into terror. I've picked up hitchhikers before, but this one was different. It was late, and the highway stretched endlessly ahead of me, the only company being the rhythmic hum of the engine. The man I pulled over for looked harmless enough, standing by the roadside with his thumb out, wearing a worn jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. I slowed down, thinking it'd be nice to have someone to chat with on the long drive ahead. But the moment he got in, I felt a chill. Something about his silence was unsettling. For a while, he didn't say much, just stared out the window as we cruised down the empty highway. The atmosphere in the truck felt heavy, like something eerie was hanging in the air between us. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He turned to me slowly, his eyes cold, almost calculating. "Just drive," he muttered. That was when I noticed it. the way his hand shifted inside his jacket, and in the next second, he pulled out a gun. My heart stopped. "Take me where I tell you," he ordered, his voice low but commanding. I was frozen in place, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. How had I gotten into this? I'd always been cautious, but now I was trapped in my own truck with a gun pointed at me. "Don't do anything stupid," he added, leaning closer. The chilling realization that I was now in a deadly game of life or death sunk in. The highway, which had once seemed so open and free, now felt like a prison. I kept driving, trying to keep my cool, but every second felt like it stretched into an eternity. The darkness outside matched the growing terror inside me. "Where do you want me to take you?" I asked, trying to sound calm. He grinned, a haunting smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "I'll tell you when we get there," he said, tapping the gun against his knee. As we drove on, I kept searching for an opportunity to escape. The highway was empty, not a soul in sight for miles. Every time I thought about making a move, his hand tightened on the gun, reminding me that one wrong move could be my last. The eerie silence of the road was only broken by the occasional sigh of the wind and the soft hum of the tires on asphalt. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to get out of this alive. After what felt like hours, I saw a sign in the distance, a rest stop. An idea started to form. "I need gas," I said, hoping to sound convincing. "We won't make it much further." He narrowed his eyes but nodded slowly. "Fine, but don't try anything," he warned, the gun still in his hand. My hands shook as I pulled into the dimly lit gas station, praying there would be someone there who could help. But when I looked around, it was empty. I stepped out, trying to act casual, but inside, my heart was racing. As I pumped gas, I caught sight of something in the corner of my eye. A police car parked at the far end of the lot. My heart leaped. I had to do something, fast. I turned toward the store, pretending to need something. And as soon as I was out of his sight, I made a dash for the officer. Bursting into the station, I frantically explained what was happening. The officer acted quickly, radioing for backup as I hid behind the counter. Minutes later, the police arrived, surrounding my truck. I heard shouting, the screech of tires, and then gunfire. My heart pounded as I peeked around the corner, terrified of what might happen next. After what felt like an eternity, the police apprehended the hitchhiker. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I was alive. The whole encounter felt like a nightmare, one that still haunts me whenever I think about picking up a stranger. The highway no longer feels like the open road of freedom it once did. It's become a place filled with shadows, a reminder that danger can hide in plain sight. Even now, I sometimes find myself glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone there waiting. That night changed me. I've never picked up another hitchhiker since, and I doubt I ever will. The haunting memory of that man, his gun, and the cold look in his eyes stays with me. There are some risks in life that just aren't worth taking, and I learned that the hard way. The road may be long, but sometimes it's better to travel it alone than to take a chance on a stranger. It was supposed to be a simple hike. Just me and a group of friends out in the woods, looking to escape the hustle of everyday life. We were miles away from civilization, surrounded by towering trees and the quiet of nature. The trail we followed wasn't marked on any map, but that only made it more exciting. An adventure into the unknown. Little did we know that our peaceful trek would soon turn into a nightmare. We had been hiking for hours when we stumbled upon an old, run-down cabin hidden deep in the forest. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for years, but something felt off. The windows were boarded up, and there was a strange smell in the air, a mix of chemicals and rot. My gut told me we should turn back, but curiosity got the better of us. We edged closer, peeking through a crack in the door, and that's when we saw it. A fully operational meth lab. Panic hit us like a wave. This was bad. Really bad. Before we could even think about leaving, we heard voices coming from behind the cabin. A group of men, armed and dangerous, appeared out of nowhere, and they didn't look happy to see us. "Get them," one of them shouted. My heart dropped as we realized we had been spotted. Without a second thought, we bolted, sprinting back down the trail we came from, our footsteps pounding against the earth. The woods, which had felt so peaceful moments ago, now seemed like a labyrinth of terror. The men were right behind us, shouting and firing shots into the air. Every gunshot echoed through the trees, sending chills down my spine. We didn't know where we were going. We just ran. My legs were burning, my breath ragged, but the fear of being caught kept me moving. There was no way we could let them catch us. As the sun began to set, the forest grew darker and more disorienting. We were lost, with no idea how far away the road was. The men chasing us weren't far behind, and the thought of what they'd do if they caught us made my stomach churn. The eerie quiet of the forest was now filled with the haunting sounds of our pursuers crashing through the underbrush, getting closer and closer. Every second felt like a countdown to disaster. We stumbled upon a small creek, its water rushing over rocks, and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead us to safety. The water was cold and fast, but it masked the sound of our movements, giving us a slight advantage. For a brief moment, I thought we might make it. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. One of the men, armed and searching for us, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. We froze, barely daring to breathe. Hours passed, or at least it felt like it. The night was cold and unforgiving, and we were exhausted. We had to keep moving, though. The armed men weren't giving up. We stumbled through the forest, dodging trees and trying to stay hidden, but the terror never let up. Every crack of a branch made my heart race. Every shadow seemed like it was moving. It was a game of survival, and we were losing. Just when I thought we couldn't go on any longer, we heard a sound in the distance. Sirens. The police. Relief flooded through me like a wave. Somehow, someone must have called for help, or maybe we had tripped a silent alarm near the cabin. Whatever the reason, we were saved. We followed the sound of the sirens, our legs barely holding us up as we pushed forward. The police arrived just in time. The armed men were still close, but as soon as they heard the sirens, they scattered into the woods, disappearing into the night like shadows. The officers found us moments later, cold, terrified, but alive. I'll never forget the look on their faces when we told them about the meth lab hidden deep in the forest. It was a lucky break that we had made it out at all. The next day, the police raided the cabin, but by then, the men had cleared out. The lab was destroyed, but the memory of that night, the fear of being hunted, still haunts me. The forest isn't the peaceful escape it once was. Now, whenever I think of hiking, I can't help but remember the chilling darkness of those woods, and the eerie feeling that we were never alone. It's funny how something as simple as a hike can turn deadly so fast. What was supposed to be an adventure with friends became a fight for survival. And though we escaped, the haunting memory of that night will forever stay with me. A reminder that sometimes danger is hiding where you least expect it. It was just another quiet night shift at the office. As the janitor, I'd gotten used to the eerie silence that fell over the building after hours. It was a massive, sprawling office complex, the kind of place that seemed to stretch on forever, especially when you were the only one there. The halls were dimly lit, and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound that accompanied me as I went about my routine. But that night, something felt off. I was cleaning the break room when I heard it, a faint noise, like footsteps, coming from one of the upper floors. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the sound persisted, growing louder with each passing minute. My heart started to race, but I brushed it off, figuring it was just one of the office workers who'd stayed late. That's when I saw them, shadows moving in the reflection of the glass door. 3 men, dressed in black, creeping through the hall. Panic hit me like a freight train. These guys weren't supposed to be here, and the way they moved, silent, calculated, told me they were up to no good. I ducked behind the counter, holding my breath as I peeked through a crack in the door. They were heading toward the main office, and from what I could see, they were armed. This wasn't just a robbery, they were looking for something specific. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I knew the building like the back of my hand, every stairwell, every hidden corner. If I could make it to the security office, I could lock myself in and call for help. But the only way there was up, past the thieves. I crept out of the break room, staying low, moving as silently as I could. Every step felt like it echoed in the empty halls, and I could hear the men's voices growing louder as they rifled through the desks, searching for something. Just as I reached the stairwell, one of them turned, his eyes scanning the hallway. I froze, barely daring to breathe. His gaze lingered for a moment, then he turned back to his task. I didn't wait to see if he'd notice me. I bolted up the stairs, taking 2 at a time, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of footsteps followed me. They'd heard me. I burst through the door onto the rooftop, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't plan on being chased onto the roof, but there I was, trapped. The only way down was the fire escape on the other side of the building, but the thieves were right behind me. One of them came out onto the roof, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I ducked behind an air conditioning unit, trying to stay out of sight. The rooftop was eerily quiet, except for the sound of my own labored breathing. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching fast. One of the thieves was heading straight for me. I had seconds to act. Without thinking, I darted from my hiding spot, sprinting toward the edge of the roof. The man shouted, his voice angry, and then I felt it, a hand grabbing the back of my jacket. He yanked me backward, trying to pull me down. In a desperate move, I twisted out of his grip and stumbled forward, barely keeping my balance. I reached the fire escape and started climbing down as fast as I could. The metal rungs were cold and slick under my hands, and every step felt like a death sentence. The man was still above me, yelling to his friends below. I had to move faster. My legs burned, my hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop. I was almost at the bottom when I heard the crack of a gunshot. The bullet hit the metal railing just inches from my head. I flinched, nearly losing my grip. Finally, I hit the ground and ran toward the nearest building. I found a maintenance closet and locked myself inside, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear them searching for me outside, their voices low and menacing. I fumbled with my phone, praying I had a signal. By some miracle, I did. I called the police, whispering my location as quietly as I could. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. When the police finally arrived, the thieves were still inside, tearing apart the offices. I stayed hidden in that closet until I heard the sirens and the sound of officers storming the building. They caught the men trying to escape, and I finally let out the breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I was safe, but the terror of that night still clings to me. I later found out that the thieves were after confidential corporate files, something that could have cost millions if they'd gotten away with it. It's scary to think how close they came. To this day, I can't shake the memory of being chased across that rooftop, the eerie darkness of the night, and the haunting feeling of knowing just how close I came to falling into their hands. The office, once a place of quiet routine, now feels like a maze of shadows and danger. It was supposed to be an easy night of babysitting. The parents had left clear instructions, and the child, a quiet little boy named Tommy, seemed like a dream to watch. The house was cozy, and after putting Tommy to bed, I settled down on the couch with a book. Everything was peaceful, almost too peaceful. It was that eerie kind of quiet that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, but I brushed it off. That's when the first strange noise broke the silence. I heard the faint sound of a notification ping coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it was just my phone, but then I realized my phone was right next to me. Confused, I tiptoed up the stairs toward Tommy's room. When I peeked inside, I found him sitting up in bed, his face lit up by the glow of his tablet. "Tommy, what are you doing up?" I whispered. He looked up at me, wide-eyed, and said, "I was just talking to my friend online." That sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't seen him use the tablet all night, and as far as I knew, he wasn't supposed to be online. "What friend?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Tommy just shrugged, his eyes darting back to the screen. He said he's outside. My heart dropped. I grabbed the tablet from his hands and scrolled through the messages. There they were. A series of chilling exchanges between Tommy and someone who claimed to be watching the house. Panic started to rise in my chest. I locked the tablet and rushed to the window. Outside, the street was empty, but the eerie feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. I quickly drew the curtains and turned back to Tommy. "We need to stay away from the windows," I told him, trying to sound calm even though my mind was racing. Whoever this person was, they were out there, and they knew we were inside. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, when the front door rattled. Someone was trying to get in. My heart pounded as I quickly dialed 911, whispering into the phone that someone was breaking into the house. "Stay calm," the dispatcher said. "Help is on the way." But as I hung up, the door handle turned. The eerie quiet was shattered by the sound of the door creaking open. Without thinking, I scooped Tommy into my arms and rushed upstairs. The only place I could think to hide was the attic. My hands shook as I pulled down the ladder and climbed up, Tommy clutching my neck in fear. We hid behind old boxes, the attic dark and filled with dust. Downstairs, I could hear the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. The intruder was inside, and they were looking for us. The tension was unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards below felt like a countdown to disaster. I held my breath, trying to keep Tommy quiet, though he was trembling with fear. The footsteps moved through the house, closer and closer to the attic. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and for a moment, I thought we were done for. Then, the footsteps stopped. For what felt like hours, there was nothing but silence. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. My phone vibrated. The police were outside. Relief washed over me as I heard the front door burst open, followed by the sound of officers calling out. I climbed down from the attic, holding Tommy tightly as we were met by 2 officers. They moved through the house, searching every corner, but the intruder was gone. The police stayed with us until Tommy's parents returned home, but by then, the danger had passed. We were safe, but the memory of that night stayed with me long after. I later found out that the stranger had been watching the house for weeks, targeting Tommy through his online activity. The eerie feeling of being watched, the chilling messages, it was all part of his sick plan. I haven't babysat since that night. The thought of being alone in someone else's home, responsible for a child's safety, sends a shiver down my spine. That night, I came face to face with something truly terrifying. Not just the intruder, but the realization that danger can come from places you'd never expect. The experience haunts me still, a reminder that in the quietest moments, the most chilling threats can be lurking just outside your door. Hiking alone had always been my escape. There's something about the solitude, the whisper of the wind through the trees, the way the wilderness makes you feel like the world has fallen away. That day, I set off early, ready to lose myself in nature, with only the sound of my footsteps for company. The trail was rugged but familiar, winding through a dense forest that stretched for miles. But as the hours passed and the light began to fade, I realized something. I was lost. I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere, straying off the beaten path. I told myself it was fine, I'd just retrace my steps. But the further I walked, the more disoriented I became. The trees all started to look the same, and the forest, once so peaceful, took on an eerie stillness. There was no sound, no sign of life. A sense of unease crept over me. I wasn't just lost, something felt wrong. I tried to stay calm, but that's when I heard it. Voices. At first, I was relieved, thinking I'd stumbled across other hikers. But as I drew closer, I realized the voices weren't friendly. They were hushed, angry, and coming from a small clearing just ahead. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I crouched behind a bush and peered through the branches, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw sent a chill down my spine. A group of men were gathered around a table, guns laid out in front of them, and a large, tarp-covered crate sat nearby. I didn't need to get closer to know something illegal was going on. I'd stumbled upon an operation I had no business seeing. And then one of them spotted me. Our eyes locked, and for a split second, we both froze. Then he shouted, pointing in my direction. That's when I ran. I sprinted through the trees, my heart racing as I heard the men shouting behind me. Branches whipped at my face, and the ground seemed to blur beneath my feet. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away. Gunshots cracked through the air and fear surged through me. These men weren't just dangerous. They were willing to kill to protect whatever operation they had going on. The forest felt like a maze, every direction looking the same, and I had no idea how far away I was from safety. My lungs burned as I pushed forward, weaving through the trees, trying to put as much distance between myself and my pursuers as possible. But they were gaining on me, their voices growing louder, closer. I could feel their presence, like a shadow creeping up behind me. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I spotted a small cave tucked into the side of a hill. Without hesitation, I dove inside, pressing myself against the cold, damp wall. My breathing was ragged, my heart hammering in my chest as I listened for their footsteps. They passed by the cave, still shouting, still searching. I stayed as still as I could, praying they wouldn't find me. The hours crawled by, the darkness closing in as night fell. I stayed in the cave, too terrified to move. Every sound outside made my heart race. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. I was trapped, and I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. But if I left, I risked running right into their arms. The thought of facing them again, of not surviving, sent a shiver down my spine. As dawn broke, I finally decided to move. My legs were stiff, my body sore, but I had no choice. I crept out of the cave, scanning the forest for any sign of the men. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant call of birds waking with the sun. I moved cautiously, trying to retrace my steps from the day before, hoping to find the trail and, eventually, safety. After hours of walking, exhausted and starving, I heard the faint sound of a helicopter in the distance. Hope surged through me, and I waved frantically, shouting as loud as I could. It was a search and rescue team. They'd been looking for me since I'd missed my check-in the day before. Relief washed over me as they pulled me out of the forest, away from the danger that still lingered somewhere in the trees. I never told them about the men I saw. Part of me was too scared to, worried they might come after me if word got out. The forest, which had once been my escape, now felt like a place of haunting danger. Every time I think back to that day, I can still hear the gunshots echoing through the trees and feel the chilling sensation of being hunted. The wilderness isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it hides deadly secrets. As a wildlife photographer, I've spent countless hours in forests all over the Pacific Northwest, chasing the perfect shot of animals in their natural habitat. It was always thrilling, wandering through the vast, quiet wilderness with nothing but my camera and the stillness of the woods around me. But this trip was different. It started out like any other, crisp morning air, my breath visible in the cold, and the sound of the forest waking up. But soon, I would discover I wasn't alone. I had set up my equipment near a remote lake, hoping to capture images of the local wildlife coming for a drink. Hours passed, but nothing moved except the wind through the trees. Just as I was about to pack up, I noticed something strange. The forest had grown eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. The stillness felt unnatural, as if the woods were holding their breath. A chilling feeling crept over me, but I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I decided to move to a different spot, packing up my gear and heading deeper into the woods. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the trees for any sign of movement. Whatever it was close. Too close. I grabbed my camera, ready to snap a picture, but there was nothing to see. The sound, though, lingered in the air like a haunting presence. I continued walking, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, but the sensation only grew stronger. Every few steps, I would hear a rustle behind me, or catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned several times, expecting to see a deer, or maybe a bear, but there was nothing. The forest was empty, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was stalking me, lurking just beyond my sight. The unease soon turned into fear when I heard the growl again, this time louder, closer. I picked up my pace, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I tried to keep calm. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a cougar? A wolf? Whatever it wasn't acting like any animal I'd encountered before. It wasn't just following me, it was hunting me. I hurried through the forest, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, but the predator remained hidden. The trees seemed to close in around me, the once peaceful woods now a labyrinth of danger. The growls were becoming more frequent, more menacing, and each one sent a shiver down my spine. My camera felt like dead weight in my hands now, useless in the face of whatever was stalking me. Desperation set in as I realized I was miles from the nearest trailhead, and I hadn't seen another person all day. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that panicking would only make things worse. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps following me. They were slow, deliberate, and much too heavy to belong to any animal I knew. I broke into a run, my heart racing as I pushed through the underbrush, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from whatever was behind me. The footsteps quickened, matching my pace. I could feel its presence closing in, the air around me growing colder, more oppressive. I stumbled over a root, barely catching myself, and in that moment, I knew I couldn't outrun it. That's when I saw the cliff. It loomed ahead, a steep rock face that seemed to rise out of nowhere. I had no choice. It was either climb or face whatever was behind me. I scrambled up the cliff, my hands trembling as I grabbed hold of the jagged rocks. The growls below grew louder, more frustrated, as the creature circled the base of the cliff, unable to follow me up. I dared a glance down, but all I could see was a shadowy figure pacing below. I stayed on that cliff for hours, too scared to move, waiting for the thing to leave. Night fell, and the forest was plunged into darkness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the growls faded into the distance, and the shadow disappeared into the woods. I waited a little longer, just to be sure, before carefully climbing back down. My legs shook with fear, but I knew I had to get out of there. The hike back to my car was the longest I've ever experienced. Every sound made me jump, every shadow made me flinch. When I finally reached the trailhead, I collapsed into my car, shaking with relief. I don't know what stalked me that day, but I know it wasn't just an animal. There was something unnatural about the way it moved, the way it hunted. To this day, I still can't shake the feeling that it's out there, somewhere, waiting. I'd worked as a janitor in the same office complex for years, and nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. It was always quiet during the night shift, with just the hum of the lights and the occasional flicker of a computer left on by a forgetful employee. But that night was different. I'd barely started my shift when I noticed something off. The door to one of the private offices had been left ajar, which was unusual since they were always locked after hours. I approached the door cautiously, pushing it open. Papers were scattered across the desk, and drawers had been pulled out, their contents spilled onto the floor. It didn't take long for me to realize what had happened. Someone had broken in. My heart began to race, and I could feel a chill creeping down my spine. I was alone in a massive office building, and somewhere inside, someone else was there too. I backed out of the room slowly, my mind racing with what to do next. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps echoing from down the hall. I wasn't alone, and whoever was here wasn't just looking to steal office supplies. The sound grew louder, closer. I ducked into a nearby room and hid behind a desk, my heart pounding in my ears. From the shadows, I could see them. 3 men, dressed in black and armed, moving methodically through the building. They weren't petty thieves. They were looking for something specific, something valuable. My mind raced as I tried to figure out how to escape. I couldn't just walk out the front door. It was too risky. I needed to get to the roof, where I could access the fire escape and call for help. Slowly, I crawled out of my hiding spot, moving as quietly as possible. The tension was suffocating. Every step I took filled with dread that they'd hear me. I made it to the stairwell and bolted up the stairs, my legs shaking as I climbed. The office building felt like a maze, every hallway and door blending into one another. As I reached the roof, I thought I was in the clear, but just as I stepped outside, I heard a voice shout, "Hey!" One of the men had seen me. Panic shot through me like electricity, and I ran across the rooftop, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I heard the pounding of footsteps behind me as I sprinted toward the far side of the roof. My only chance was to get to the fire escape, but it felt like miles away. The cold night air stunned my lungs, and fear surged through me as I realized they were gaining on me. I could hear their voices, angry, and then the chilling sound of a gun being cocked. They were armed, and they weren't going to let me escape easily. In a desperate move, I ducked behind an air conditioning unit, trying to catch my breath. I could hear them searching for me, their voices low and threatening as they called out to one another. The rooftop was vast, but I knew I couldn't stay hidden for long. I peeked out from behind the unit, my heart pounding in my chest. They were getting closer, and I was running out of time. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. Suddenly, one of the men appeared around the corner, his flashlight sweeping the area. I froze, barely daring to breathe as the light passed over me. For a moment, I thought I'd been spotted, but then he turned away. I took my chance and bolted for the fire escape. My shoes clanged loudly against the metal steps as I scrambled down, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. I reached the bottom and darted into the alley behind the building, my heart racing with relief. But as I rounded the corner, I ran straight into another one of the men. He grabbed me by the collar, shoving me against the wall. His eyes were cold, his grip tight. "You picked the wrong night to show up," he growled. I struggled to get free, my mind blank with terror, but just as he raised his fist, I heard sirens in the distance. The man let go of me, his eyes narrowing in frustration. He and his crew scattered into the night, disappearing before the police could arrive. I collapsed against the wall, shaking from the adrenaline and fear. The police found me moments later, their flashing lights a welcome sight after the terror I had just escaped. They searched the building, but the men were long gone, leaving behind nothing but the mess they had made. I never found out exactly what they were after, but the police hinted at classified documents, something worth risking everything for. That night, the office complex I knew so well turned into a nightmare of danger and dread. Even now, the memory haunts me, the eerie quiet of the halls forever tainted by the fear I felt as I ran for my life. The thought of going back to work still sends a chill down my spine. The office may seem safe by day, but at night, it becomes a place where shadows hide chilling threats. It was just supposed to be a regular babysitting gig, nothing out of the ordinary. The house was in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, the kind where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. The parents had left detailed instructions, and the child, Emma, was already tucked in bed when they left. The night started off uneventful, just the usual routine of checking in on Emma and watching TV in the living room. But not long after they left, I started feeling that unsettling chill. Like something was off. I was halfway through a movie when I noticed Emma's tablet light flicker in the hallway. I found her sitting on her bed, the glow of the screen illuminating her face. "What are you doing up, sweetheart?" I asked, surprised to see her awake. She looked at me, her small voice barely a whisper. "I'm just talking to my friend," she said, pointing at the screen. Curious, I took the tablet from her hands and glanced at the conversation. The messages made my blood run cold. Whoever Emma had been chatting with wasn't a friend. The messages were unsettling, full of odd questions about the house and our plans for the evening. The last message sent a shiver down my spine. "I see you." My heart started racing. I immediately asked Emma how long she had been talking to this person, and she simply shrugged, saying he had been messaging her for a few weeks now. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps outside the house. I rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The street was empty, but the eerie feeling that someone was watching us was overwhelming. I quickly locked the windows and doors, trying to stay calm for Emma's sake. "We're going to stay upstairs for a bit, okay?" I told her, trying to mask the fear in my voice. We moved quietly to her bedroom, and I checked my phone to see if I had missed any messages from her parents. Nothing. As I sat with Emma, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. My phone vibrated in my hand, and when I looked at the screen, my heart sank. A text from an unknown number appeared. "You shouldn't have locked the doors." Panic surged through me. Whoever this person was, they were close. I turned off the lights, grabbed Emma's hand, and led her into the closet. We hid there in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest, listening to the silence, waiting. The sound of the front door creaking open echoed through the house. My breath caught in my throat. Someone had broken in. I held Emma close, whispering for her to stay quiet. Footsteps moved slowly through the house, heavy and deliberate. I could hear the intruder opening doors, checking rooms. Each step felt like a countdown to disaster, and I prayed that the police would arrive soon. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense as I waited for the inevitable. The door creaked open, and I could hear the intruder's slow breathing, the sound of him moving through the room. He was close, so close that I could feel the terror radiating from Emma as she clung to me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do if he found us. Just as I thought all hope was lost, we heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. The intruder must have heard them too, because the next thing I knew, the footsteps were retreating, fast. The front door slammed shut, and the house fell into an eerie silence. I waited a few moments before stepping out of the closet, my legs trembling as I made my way to the window. The figure of a man in a dark hoodie disappeared into the night just as the police arrived. The officers searched the house, but by then, the stalker was long gone. They found no evidence of forced entry. He had somehow gotten in without leaving a trace. As I explained everything to the police, I couldn't help but feel a haunting dread settle over me. Whoever this person was, they had been watching us the entire night, maybe even longer. The thought that he had been so close, that he had been in the same room as us, still sends shivers down my spine. Emma's parents were horrified when they returned, and we all agreed that something like this should never happen again. They changed all the locks, updated their security system, but the fear lingered. Even though the police promised to keep an eye on the neighborhood, I couldn't shake the feeling that the stalker was still out there, watching, waiting for another opportunity. That night changed everything for me. Babysitting had always been an easy way to make extra money, but now it felt like a dangerous game. The eerie feeling of being watched, the haunting silence of the house, it all stays with me. I don't babysit anymore. I can't. Not after the terror of that night. Sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear those footsteps creeping through the house, and I wonder if he'll ever come back. I was driving late at night, the highway stretching out in front of me, empty and silent. It was the kind of drive where the only company you have is the faint hum of the radio and the eerie glow of the dashboard lights. I've always found those long, solitary drives peaceful, but that night, something felt off. As I glanced in my rearview mirror, I noticed a pair of headlights far behind me. At first, I thought nothing of it, but the car seemed to be following me. Its lights never fading, never passing. I changed lanes, hoping it would pass by, but the car stayed behind, mimicking every move I made. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't uncommon to see another car on the road this late, but the way it followed me felt intentional, almost haunting. My heart started to race as I glanced back again. The car was closer now, its headlights blinding in my rearview mirror. Whoever was behind the wheel wanted me to know they were there. I sped up, hoping to lose them, but the car matched my speed. The once peaceful drive had turned into a tense, high-stakes game. Every turn I made, the car followed. It was no coincidence. This person was stalking me. Panic set in as I realized there was no one else on the road, no gas stations or rest stops in sight. The isolation of the highway, which once felt freeing, now felt suffocating and dangerous. After a few more miles of this eerie chase, the car suddenly sped up, pulling alongside me. I glanced over, my heart pounding in my chest. The windows were tinted too dark to see the driver, but I could feel their eyes on me. They swerved toward my car, forcing me onto the shoulder. My hands shook as I fought to keep control of the wheel. I knew I had to get off the highway, but where could I go? I spotted an exit up ahead, leading into a forested area. Without thinking, I took it, hoping the narrow, winding roads would be too difficult for the stalker to follow. But they stayed right on my tail, their headlights illuminating the trees that lined the road. The fear was palpable now, my breath coming in short gasps as I tried to lose them. The winding road only added to the tension, each sharp turn feeling like a potential disaster. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated an abandoned shack just off the road, barely visible through the trees. It was my only option. I pulled off and sped toward it, my tires skidding on the gravel. I jumped out of the car and sprinted toward the shack, my legs trembling with fear. The sound of the other car's engine followed me, growing louder as it approached. I threw myself inside the shack, slamming the door behind me. The shack was dark and musty, the air thick with decay. I crouched behind an old wooden table, trying to steady my breath. Outside, I could hear the car idling, the engine humming ominously. My heart raced as I listened for footsteps, praying they wouldn't come inside. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Then, the engine cut off, and everything went silent. I held my breath, listening intently for any sound of movement. The silence was haunting, making every creak of the old shack feel like a gunshot. My muscles ached from tension, but I didn't dare move. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard the engine roar to life again. I peeked through a crack in the door and saw the car pulling away, its headlights disappearing down the road. I stayed hidden for a while longer, too scared to move. When I finally emerged, the night was eerily quiet again. I stumbled back to my car, my legs weak and my mind still racing. I drove straight to the nearest town, my hands shaking the entire way. When I finally reached safety, I called the police, but by then, there was nothing they could do. The stalker had vanished into the night, leaving no trace behind. That night changed the way I look at long drives. What was once a peaceful escape now feels like a haunting reminder of how vulnerable you can be on the open road. The eerie silence of the highway, the isolation, it all carries a chilling weight now. I don't drive alone at night anymore. Not after that encounter. The feeling of being hunted, of being at the mercy of someone else's twisted game, still lingers in the back of my mind. It was supposed to be a romantic weekend getaway. Just the two of us, isolated at a cozy lake house miles away from the nearest town. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the still water, and everything felt perfect. We spent the evening cooking dinner, laughing and enjoying the peace and quiet. But as night fell, the atmosphere began to change. The once serene setting started to feel eerie, and that haunting feeling of being too alone started creeping in. We had just settled into bed when the power cut out, plunging the house into total darkness. At first, we thought it might have been a blown fuse or something minor, but when we checked the breakers, everything seemed fine. The wind had picked up outside, howling through the trees, making the silence inside the house even more unsettling. A chilling thought crossed my mind. What if this wasn't just a power outage? We decided to light some candles and stay close, brushing off the strange feeling that had settled over us. But then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. They were slow, deliberate, crunching on the gravel driveway just outside the window. My heart raced as I grabbed my partner's hand. We both froze, listening, hoping it was just an animal. But the sound grew louder, closer. Someone was out there. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door, followed by the sound of the doorknob rattling. My breath caught in my throat. Who would be out here in the middle of the night? My partner whispered that we should stay quiet, but panic was already setting in. The rattling stopped for a moment, but then we heard a scraping sound, like someone was trying to pry the door open. The eerie silence outside the house made every noise inside feel amplified, each one more terrifying than the last. We crept toward the window, peeking out through the small gap in the curtains. In the dim candlelight, we could make out a figure standing by the door. The man was tall, his face obscured by the darkness, but his presence was unmistakably menacing. He wasn't trying to break in quickly. He was toying with us, taking his time, knowing that we had nowhere to go. A wave of fear washed over me. We were trapped. Without power, our phones were nearly dead, and the landline had been disconnected when the electricity went out. We couldn't call for help. The only way out was through the lake, but the thought of swimming in the pitch-black water sent shivers down my spine. Still, we didn't have a choice. We grabbed what little we could and quietly made our way to the back door, praying the intruder wouldn't hear us. The back door creaked as we opened it, and we winced at the sound. We could still hear the intruder trying to force his way inside, but he hadn't noticed us yet. The lake stretched out before us, dark and foreboding, but it was our only escape. With our hearts pounding, we slipped into the cold water, swimming as quietly as possible. Every splash felt deafening, and I kept glancing back at the house, terrified that he would see us. Halfway across the lake, I heard the front door crash open. My blood ran cold as I realized he was inside. The thought of what he might do if he found us sent a surge of adrenaline through me, and we swam faster, the cold water biting at our skin. I could hear him moving through the house, his footsteps heavy and slow. He was searching for us, and the eerie silence of the night made every sound more haunting. We reached the far side of the lake, hiding behind a large rock as we caught our breath. From there, we could see the house. The intruder had turned on a flashlight, his beam sweeping across the rooms as he searched for us. My body trembled with fear, but at least we were safe, for now. We huddled together, waiting for what felt like hours until we finally saw the beam of light disappear. The intruder was gone. At dawn, we made our way back to the house. The door had been ripped open, and the inside was trashed. Whoever the intruder was, he had taken nothing, only left behind the chilling reminder that we weren't as safe as we thought. We never found out who he was or why he targeted us, but the memory of that night, the feeling of being hunted, will stay with me forever. The lake house, once a place of peace and romance, now feels like a haunting memory, tainted by the fear that gripped us. Even now, the sound of footsteps outside in the night sends a shiver down my spine. We survived, but that eerie feeling of being watched, of knowing someone was out there, lingers, making me question if we're ever truly alone. I was staying at a remote farm for a weekend, looking for some peace and quiet. The farmhouse was quaint, and the sprawling fields stretched out endlessly. It felt like a perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of the city. The farm's owners had gone into town for the evening, leaving me to enjoy the serenity on my own. As dusk settled over the land, the peaceful atmosphere began to feel eerily quiet. Something about the stillness sent a chill down my spine. I decided to take a walk around the property, just to enjoy the evening air before nightfall. The old barn at the edge of the field caught my eye. Its weathered wood and sagging roof made it look abandoned, but there was something almost haunting about the way it stood against the fading light. I wandered closer, curious. As I reached the door, I hesitated. There was an uneasy feeling gnawing at me, but I brushed it off and pushed the door open. Inside, the barn smelled of old hay and dust. The darkness swallowed everything beyond the faint beam of my flashlight. I took a few cautious steps inside, and that's when I saw him. A man, crouched in the corner, his eyes wild. My heart stopped. He looked filthy, like he'd been hiding out there for days. His clothes were torn, and the chilling way he stared at me made my blood run cold. Before I could react, he stood up, brandishing a knife. "Get out," he growled, his voice low and threatening. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back toward the door, my hands shaking. But he moved fast, blocking my way out. My heart raced as I realized I was trapped. The barn, once a place of simple curiosity, had become a prison. The air felt thick with fear as I tried to think of a way to escape. I darted toward the far side of the barn, hoping to find another way out. He chased after me, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached a ladder leading up to the loft. Without thinking, I scrambled up, praying he wouldn't follow. But as I reached the top, I heard him climbing behind me. There was nowhere to go. The loft was a dead end. The darkness pressed in around me as I searched for something, anything, to defend myself with. My hands closed around a rusty pitchfork, and I spun around just as he reached the top of the ladder. My body trembled with fear, but I had no choice. I swung the pitchfork wildly, hoping to keep him at bay. He snarled, slashing the air with his knife, barely missing me. The barn echoed with the sounds of our struggle, the once quiet night now filled with chaos. I knew I couldn't keep this up. Desperation clawed at me as I realized my only chance was to get back down to the ground and make a run for it. I feigned a lunge at him, and as he stepped back, I grabbed the opportunity to dart past him. I slid down the ladder, my feet barely touching the rungs, and bolted for the door. He was right behind me, his footsteps pounding the floor as he closed in. My eyes landed on an old tractor parked near the barn doors. In a last-ditch effort, I scrambled onto it, frantically searching for the ignition. To my shock, the keys were still in it. My hands shook as I turned the key, the engine sputtering to life just as he reached the tractor. Without thinking, I slammed my foot down on the gas, driving the tractor straight through the barn doors, wood splintering as I crashed through. I didn't look back. The tractor rumbled down the dirt path, my heart pounding in my chest as I sped away. The barn, now a wreck behind me, disappeared into the darkness. I could still feel his presence, though. The haunting memory of his wild eyes, the chilling sound of his footsteps as he chased me. I didn't stop until I reached the farmhouse, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. When the farm owners returned, I told them everything. They called the police, but by the time they searched the barn, the man was gone, vanished into the night, leaving no trace behind. The eerie stillness of the farm returned, but it no longer felt peaceful. The haunting reality of how close I'd come to something terrible weighed on me. The barn, once just a curious old structure, had turned into a place of terror. I still think about that night sometimes, about the fear that gripped me as I ran for my life. The thought of him hiding out there, watching, waiting, still sends shivers down my spine. I haven't been back to that farm since. The memory of the barn, of that chilling chase through the darkness, is something I'll never forget. We were supposed to have a relaxing weekend getaway at a remote mountain lodge. A group of close friends snowed in, spending a few days away from the world. The lodge was cozy, with a roaring fireplace and thick blankets, surrounded by thick pine trees and the white blanket of fresh snow. It felt like a dream. We'd arrived in the early afternoon, setting everything up, planning to spend the evening playing board games and sipping hot cocoa. But as the night crept in, a chilling unease began to settle over us. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, causing the windows to rattle. It was snowing heavily now, the storm much worse than the forecast had predicted. We were completely cut off from the world. No cell service, no way down the mountain until the storm passed. At first, we laughed it off, joking about being stuck in a snow globe. But then, we heard a knock at the door. The sound was so faint, we almost didn't hear it over the wind. Confused, we all exchanged nervous glances. There was no way anyone could have made it up the mountain in this storm. One of us cautiously opened the door, but no one was there. Just the swirling snow and the darkness. We shrugged it off, assuming the wind had caused the noise, but there was a growing tension in the air, something eerie we couldn't quite explain. It felt like we weren't alone. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, and the temperature in the lodge dropped sharply, despite the fire burning strong in the hearth. One of my friends swore they saw movement outside, a shadow slipping through the trees. But when we all looked, there was nothing. The wind howled louder, almost sounding like whispers, and the once cozy lodge began to feel more like a prison. Then, the power went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The only light came from the flickering flames of the fireplace, casting eerie shadows on the walls. That's when we heard footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate, crunching in the snow. We huddled together, our hearts racing, as the sound moved around the outside of the lodge. Whoever was out there was circling us, taking their time, knowing we had nowhere to go. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then came the chilling sound of the back door creaking open. My heart stopped. We grabbed whatever we could as weapons, fire pokers, chairs, and made our way to the kitchen where the back door was. The door was ajar, snow blowing inside. We were on edge, waiting for something to happen, when suddenly one of my friends screamed. A masked figure stood in the doorway, their breath fogging in the freezing air. Panic erupted as we scrambled to barricade ourselves inside the living room. The figure stepped forward, slow and menacing, as if they had all the time in the world. We slammed the door shut and piled furniture against it, but the terror was overwhelming. The lodge, once a safe haven, had become a death trap. We could hear the masked figure banging on the door, methodically, as if taunting us. There was no way out, and the storm outside was raging worse than ever. Desperate, we realized the only option was the cellar, which had a heavy, bolted door. We grabbed our blankets and supplies and fled down the narrow stairs, locking ourselves inside. The darkness was suffocating, the only light coming from a single lantern. We could hear the masked figure moving above us, the floorboards creaking under their weight. It felt like they were waiting for us to make a move, knowing we were trapped. We stayed in that cellar for what felt like hours, listening to the eerie silence punctuated by the occasional thump from above. The storm outside raged on, and the cold seeped into our bones. Time dragged on and we barely spoke, too terrified to make a sound. Every noise felt like a threat, and the haunting realization that we might not survive the night weighed heavily on us. Finally, as dawn began to break, the noise above stopped. We waited, holding our breath, but everything had gone silent. Cautiously, we emerged from the cellar, our hearts pounding. The lodge was empty, and the masked figure was gone. The back door was wide open, snow piled inside. We never saw the intruder again, but the memory of that night has never left us. The lodge, once a place of warmth and safety, now feels like a place of dread. Even though we survived, the eerie presence of that masked stranger haunts me. The way they moved, the way they took their time, it felt like we were being toyed with. We never found out who they were or why they targeted us. But one thing is for sure, I'll never forget the terror of that night at the mountain lodge. It was well past midnight, and I had been driving for hours through what felt like the middle of nowhere. The highway stretched out endlessly, with only the occasional flicker of a neon sign or the distant glow of headlights breaking the darkness. My gas tank was running low, and the next station seemed miles away. Just when I thought I might have to pull over and sleep in the car, I saw it. A flickering gas station sign up ahead, barely visible through the shadows. It looked old, abandoned even, but I didn't have much choice. I pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching under my tires. The place was completely deserted, the pumps rusty and the windows dark. A single light buzzed over the entrance, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. I stepped out of the car, glancing around, and a strange sense of unease settled over me. Something about the place felt off, but I ignored it and walked up to the door, hoping to find someone inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the gas station looked even worse. Dusty shelves, a broken-down counter, and no sign of anyone. I called out, but the only answer was the echo of my own voice. The place was definitely abandoned, but the gas pump still looked functional. I decided to fuel up and get back on the road as fast as possible. As I headed back to my car, that's when I heard it, the faint sound of engines approaching. At first, I thought it was just another late-night traveler like me, but as the sound grew louder, I realized something was wrong. A truck roared into the lot, its headlights blinding me as it skidded to a stop. 2 more trucks followed, pulling in on either side of my car. Panic surged through me as I realized I was surrounded. The truck's engines rumbled ominously, and before I could react, a group of men jumped out, their faces hidden by bandanas. They were armed. One of them shouted at me, demanding I hand over my wallet and keys. My hands shook as I did what they said, trying to keep my cool, but fear was making my heart race. The men laughed, their voices low and menacing. The abandoned gas station, once a silent refuge, had turned into a chilling trap. They weren't just robbing me, they were enjoying it, dragging out the moment. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, one of them pulled out a gun and aimed it right at me. "On your knees," he barked. My breath caught in my throat, and I dropped to the ground, the cold gravel biting into my skin. I couldn't believe this was happening. The darkness of the night pressed in on me, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I had to find a way out. In a split second, I made a decision. As the men were distracted, arguing among themselves, I spotted a drainage pipe running alongside the station. It wasn't far, but I'd have to move fast. Gathering every ounce of courage, I bolted, running for the pipe as gunshots cracked through the air behind me. I dove into the narrow opening, the sound of bullets whizzing past me. My heart pounded as I crawled through the pipe, the cold, damp metal pressing against my skin. The pipe was dark and claustrophobic, but it was my only chance. I kept moving, my body scraping against the walls, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I could hear the men shouting outside, their footsteps getting closer. I squeezed deeper into the pipe, praying they wouldn't find me. The darkness was suffocating, and every sound seemed amplified. The dripping of water, the scuffling of my shoes, the pounding of my heart. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. I stayed hidden, too terrified to move. Finally, the shouting faded, and the sound of the trucks revving up echoed through the night. They were leaving. I waited a little longer, just to be sure, before cautiously crawling back out. My body ached, my clothes were soaked, and my hands were scraped raw, but I was alive. The gas station was silent again, the trucks gone, the eerie glow of the flickering light casting long shadows on the empty lot. I stumbled back to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the door. The air felt cold and oppressive, the fear still clinging to me like a second skin. I drove away, the abandoned gas station disappearing in my rearview mirror. But the memory of that night, the terror, the gunshots, the narrow escape, haunted me. To this day, I can't stop at a gas station without thinking about it. The chilling realization that a simple stop in the middle of the night can turn deadly still lingers in my mind. The highway, once a place of freedom, now feels like a place where danger could be waiting around any corner. I was lucky to escape, but the eerie stillness of that gas station, the haunting memory of those men, will stay with me forever. The hike through the canyon was supposed to be a peaceful escape. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. Just me, the towering cliffs, and the sound of the wind rushing through the narrow passages. The canyon was vast, its walls stretching high above me, casting long, eerie shadows as the sun began to set. The silence was comforting at first, but as the light faded, an unsettling stillness began to settle over the landscape. Something didn't feel right. I quickened my pace, hoping to make it back to the trailhead before dark. The canyon walls seemed to close in around me, the once beautiful scenery now feeling more like a trap. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of voices. At first, I thought it might be other hikers, but as the voices grew louder, they didn't sound friendly. I ducked behind a large boulder, my heart racing, as a group of men appeared on the trail ahead, armed and looking dangerous. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized they hadn't seen me yet, but I knew I needed to get out of there. I tried to stay quiet, but as I took a step back, my foot slipped on a loose rock, sending it tumbling down the side of the canyon. The men stopped, their heads snapping in my direction. Panic surged through me. I bolted, running back the way I had come, my footsteps echoing off the canyon walls as their shouts followed me. The canyon floor was uneven, wet, and every step felt like a struggle as I dodged rocks and twisted branches. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself to move faster, my body fueled by fear. Behind me, I could hear the men gaining on me, their voices angry and aggressive. The once peaceful canyon had become a place of terror, and I felt like a hunted animal, trapped in a maze of cliffs and crevices. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of the men closing in. My legs burned with the effort, but I couldn't slow down. As I rounded a sharp corner, I saw it, a steep, rocky cliff rising up ahead, my only chance of escape. Without hesitation, I began to climb, grabbing onto jagged rocks and pulling myself up. The wind whipped through the canyon, chilling me to the bone, but I couldn't stop. The climb was brutal. My hands were scraped raw and my muscles screamed in protest, but I kept going. I could hear the men below, their shouts growing louder as they reached the base of the cliff. One of them threw a rock in my direction, and it narrowly missed me, crashing into the rocks below. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized just how close I was to falling. I reached a small ledge and pulled myself up, gasping for breath as I looked down. The men were climbing after me, their eyes locked on mine, determined to catch me. I had to keep moving, but the cliff was getting steeper, and the rocks were slick with moss. I pushed myself to keep climbing, each movement feeling more desperate than the last. The wind howled around me, and the drop below seemed impossibly far. Just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I spotted a narrow cave tucked into the side of the cliff. It was small, barely big enough to hide in, but it was my only chance. I scrambled toward it, squeezing inside just as one of the men reached the ledge where I had been moments before. I held my breath, my body trembling with fear as he looked around, scanning the rocks for any sign of me. I could hear their voices, muffled by the wind, as they argued about where I had gone. I stayed as still as possible, the eerie silence of the cave pressing in around me. Time seemed to stretch on forever as I waited, my heart pounding in my ears. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard their voices fading as they gave up the search and climbed back down. I stayed hidden in the cave until I was sure they were gone. My body ached from the climb, and my hands were raw, but I had survived. Slowly, I crawled out of the cave and looked down at the canyon below. The men were gone, but the memory of their voices, the terror of being chased, stayed with me. The canyon, once a place of beauty, now felt like a haunting reminder of how quickly things could turn deadly. I made my way back down the cliff, my legs shaking with exhaustion. The hike back to the trailhead was long and grueling, every step a reminder of how close I had come to disaster. I never saw the men again, but the eerie feeling of being hunted, of knowing that danger had been lurking in such a peaceful place, still haunts me. The canyon, with its towering walls and narrow passages, will always be a place of beauty, but also a place of fear. Working the night shift in a high-rise office building had always been peaceful, if not a bit eerie. The building was almost empty after hours, the hum of the air conditioning and the soft glow of the emergency lights my only companions. That night, as I finished up my cleaning rounds, I stepped into the elevator, ready to head down to the lobby and call it a night. But as soon as the doors slid shut, I felt the atmosphere change. The lights flickered and the elevator jolted suddenly, coming to a stop between floors. I pressed the button for the lobby again, but nothing happened. My heart sank. The elevator wasn't moving, and I was stuck. I pressed the emergency button, listening as the crackle of the intercom cut through the silence. "We'll send someone out to help," a voice assured me. I exhaled, trying to stay calm, but the eerie stillness of the elevator was suffocating. And then I heard something. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder. It was the sound of someone breathing. I turned around, my heart pounding, and saw him. A man, standing in the corner, staring at me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I hadn't noticed him when I stepped into the elevator, and now it felt impossible that I hadn't. His eyes were wild, and his lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile. My stomach dropped as I realized I wasn't just stuck. I was trapped with someone dangerous. "Looks like we're in here for a while," he said, his voice low and calm, as if this was all part of some sick plan. I forced myself to stay composed, but every instinct in me screamed to get out. The small space suddenly felt even smaller, the walls closing in as the man took a step closer. "What do you think's going to happen?" he asked, tilting his head like a predator sizing up its prey. My hands shook as I pressed the emergency button again, but the line was dead. He took another step forward, his eyes never leaving mine. My heart raced, and I backed into the corner, my mind scrambling for a way out. The elevator was sealed tight, no way to pry the doors open, no way to escape. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice turning darker, more menacing. Panic surged through me as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife. The blade gleamed under the flickering lights, and the sight of it made my blood run cold. Without thinking, I lunged for the control panel, slamming my hand against the buttons, hoping for anything that could break the moment. The elevator groaned, shuddering as it moved slightly, but then stopped again with a sickening thud. The man laughed, a chilling sound that echoed off the metal walls. "It's just you and me now," he whispered, stepping closer, the knife glinting in his hand. Desperation took over. I had to do something, anything, to get out. My eyes darted to the small hatch in the ceiling of the elevator. My only chance. Without thinking, I shoved past him, climbing onto the handrails and pushing the hatch open. He lunged at me, the knife swiping through the air as I pulled myself up into the elevator shaft. My muscles strained as I gripped the edge, barely managing to hoist myself into the narrow space above. The man cursed below, banging on the walls of the elevator as I crawled through the shaft, my body trembling with fear. The darkness of the shaft was suffocating, but it was safer than being trapped in that metal box with him. I had no idea where I was going or how far the drop was below me, but I couldn't stop. My breath came in ragged gasps as I felt my way through the darkness, praying that the elevator wouldn't suddenly drop. Behind me, I could hear the man climbing through the hatch, his breath heavy with anger. My hand slipped on the metal as I tried to move faster, the cold air biting at my skin. I felt the shaft shake as he reached for my legs, the knife scraping against the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, each second feeling like a lifetime. I had to escape. I couldn't let him catch me. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. A small platform above me, leading to another elevator door. I grabbed onto the edge, pulling myself up with every ounce of strength I had left. The man was right behind me, his footsteps echoing through the shaft. With a final burst of energy, I yanked open the door and tumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. I slammed the door shut behind me, hearing his frustrated scream as the elevator suddenly dropped, plunging him into the darkness below. I collapsed on the floor, my body shaking from adrenaline. The silence in the hallway was eerie, but it was over. The nightmare was finally over. I could still hear the faint hum of the other elevators as I sat there, the weight of what had just happened crashing over me. I had escaped, but the memory of that man, his chilling smile, and the way he toyed with me would haunt me forever. The night shift, once so peaceful, now felt like a place of terror. The elevator, a simple part of my routine, had become the scene of a horror I would never forget. Every time I step into an elevator now, I can't help but remember that night, the eerie stillness, and the haunting feeling of being trapped with someone who had every intention of ending my life. I had heard rumors about a strange, undocumented creature lurking in the depths of the forest, but I never put much stock in them. As a wildlife photographer, I've spent years tracking rare animals, and most of the time, these stories are just that, stories. But there was something about this particular rumor that stuck with me. The locals talked about glowing eyes and an eerie growling that would send chills down your spine. Naturally, I was intrigued, so I packed my gear and set out for a week-long expedition into the forest, determined to capture this mysterious creature on film. For the first few days, the forest was as peaceful as ever, with nothing unusual to report. I took pictures of deer grazing by a stream, birds nesting in the trees, and the occasional fox darting through the underbrush. But the longer I stayed, the more I began to feel like something was watching me. It was a haunting feeling, the kind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia from being alone for so long, but the sensation only grew stronger. On the fourth night, just as I was settling into my tent, I heard it, an eerie growl, low and menacing, echoing through the trees. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, not a bear, not a wolf. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my flashlight and camera, stepping out into the darkness. The forest was unnervingly still, with no sound except for the occasional rustle of leaves. That's when I saw them, two glowing eyes staring at me from the tree line. The creature was watching me. I couldn't make out its full shape, but it was tall, its eyes glowing an unnatural yellow. My breath caught in my throat, and I slowly raised my camera, hoping to capture a shot before it disappeared. But just as I clicked the shutter, the creature moved. It let out another chilling growl and began to approach me. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. I turned and ran, my heart racing as I weaved through the trees, the creature's growl growing louder behind me. It was chasing me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel its presence closing in. The forest, once peaceful and quiet, had turned into a nightmare. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt like the creature was right on my heels, ready to pounce. I didn't stop running until I reached a rocky outcrop at the edge of a cliff. With nowhere left to go, I spun around, my flashlight flickering in the darkness. The creature was there, just a few yards away, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It was humanoid in shape, but its body was covered in dark fur, its hands ending in sharp claws. The sight was chilling, unlike anything I'd ever seen in my years as a photographer. My mind raced, trying to think of a way to escape. I backed up slowly, my foot slipping dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. The creature let out another growl, stepping closer, and I realized this might be the end. But just as it prepared to lunge, a loud noise echoed through the forest, a gunshot. The creature froze, its eyes flicking toward the sound, and then it bolted into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, trembling, my heart still racing. I don't know who fired that shot, or if they even knew what they were shooting at, but they had saved my life. I quickly gathered my things and made my way back to the nearest ranger station, refusing to spend another night in that forest. The images I captured were blurry, but the memory of those glowing eyes and the haunting growl still lingers. To this day, I don't know what that creature was. Some say it's an ancient being, others think it's a mutant or some undocumented species. Whatever it is, it's still out there, lurking in the depths of the forest, waiting. The locals were right. Something eerie and chilling lives in those woods, and it's better left undisturbed. When I inherited my great-uncle's cabin deep in the woods, I thought it would be the perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. The cabin was old, weathered by time, but it had a certain charm. Nestled between towering pines, it was peaceful, isolated, exactly what I needed. I'd heard stories about my uncle's strange habits and his tendency to live as a recluse, but I figured he was just an old man who preferred solitude. I never imagined there would be anything chilling about the place. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time exploring the surrounding forest, chopping wood, and reading by the fire at night. But as the sun set on the third night, I heard something strange. It started as a faint scratching noise coming from within the walls of the cabin. At first, I thought it was a mouse or some other small animal that had found its way inside. I ignored it, telling myself it was just the sounds of the old house settling. The scratching, however, continued. Each night it grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was inside the walls was trying to get out. It was unnerving. I tried to brush it off, but the sound followed me from room to room, scratching from behind the wooden panels no matter where I sat. A cold shiver ran down my spine each time I heard it. There was something eerie about how deliberate it sounded, almost as if it was meant for me. One night, after the scratching had grown too loud to ignore, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I pried open one of the wall panels in the living room. My heart raced as I removed the wood, expecting to find a rodent nest or something harmless. But when I pulled the panel away, there was nothing there, just an empty space. The air inside the wall was stale, and the eerie silence that followed made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Confused, I checked other sections of the wall, but I found nothing. Still, the scratching persisted. I couldn't sleep, the haunting sound echoing in my ears, becoming more and more unbearable. Each night, it seemed to grow closer, almost as if it were moving toward me. I began to dread sundown, knowing the relentless noise would soon return. One evening, after another sleepless night, I decided to search the cabin more thoroughly. There had to be an explanation, I thought. I went into the attic, which I'd avoided since moving in. The air up there was thick and musty, and everything was coated in a layer of dust. As I moved a few old boxes out of the way, something caught my eye. A small door, hidden behind a pile of old furniture, almost completely concealed. My heart raced as I approached the door. It was small, barely large enough for a person to crawl through, and it was locked with an old, rusted padlock. I grabbed the crowbar and forced it open. Behind the door was a narrow passage, leading down into the walls of the cabin. The scratching, which had been quiet for the past hour, suddenly resumed, louder than ever. It was coming from deep within the passage. Every instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't. I had to know what was causing the noise. I crawled into the passage, my flashlight flickering as I descended. The walls were tight, and the air grew colder the further I went. The scratching was deafening now, as if something was clawing its way toward me. My heart pounded as I reached the end of the passage, where the walls opened up into a small, hidden room. What I found there was terrifying. In the center of the room was a large, crudely dug hole, and next to it, a stack of old photographs, pictures of my great-uncle and something else. The images showed him standing in front of the cabin, but in the background, there was a shadowy figure, a humanoid shape with long, clawed fingers. My hands trembled as I looked through the photos, each one more disturbing than the last. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence was more haunting than the noise had been, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I didn't want to stay another minute in that room. I scrambled back up the passage, my breath coming in short gasps, and slammed the door shut behind me. I left the cabin that night, abandoning the property entirely. Whatever was inside those walls, whatever my uncle had been involved with, I wanted no part of it. To this day, the memory of that scratching haunts me. I've told myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing truly dangerous inside that cabin. But deep down, I know there's something lurking within those walls, something that should never be disturbed. Working the night shift at a truck stop was usually uneventful. Most of the time, I'd see long-haul drivers stop for gas or a quick meal, and the occasional traveler would swing through, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was a small, lonely place in the middle of nowhere, with the highway stretching out endlessly in both directions. I liked the quiet and the solitude. But one night, something chilling happened that I'll never forget. It started with a group of truckers pulling in around midnight. One of them got out, a burly man in his 40s, and ordered some coffee, while his friends stayed back with their rig. I didn't think much of it until I noticed a young girl in the passenger seat of the second truck. She looked terrified, her face pale, eyes wide. Something about the way she glanced at the driver set off alarm bells in my head. It was like she was trying to signal for help without being noticed. I tried to stay calm as I rang up the trucker's order, but the image of the girl stuck with me. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. She looked out of place, too young to be traveling alone with these men in the dead of night. I decided to casually ask the trucker if they were all traveling together, hoping to get a better sense of the situation. He just grunted, barely acknowledging me, and left. For the next hour, I kept an eye on the trucks from behind the counter. The drivers were talking outside, but the girl never moved from her seat. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, too eerie, too silent. I tried to shrug it off, but then another car pulled in. This time, an older man and a different girl got out, and she had the same haunting look in her eyes. I could feel the chill run down my spine. It wasn't a coincidence. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. These weren't ordinary travelers. I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was happening right in front of me. Trafficking. The word echoed in my head. I had heard stories about human trafficking rings operating out of truck stops, using the highways to transport victims, but I had never imagined I would come face to face with it. I couldn't let it slide. I stepped into the back room and quietly called the authorities, explaining what I had seen. They told me to keep an eye on the situation and assured me that they would send someone immediately. My heart pounded as I hung up the phone, knowing that I had just put myself in a dangerous position. What if the truckers realized I was onto them? The minutes dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. The truckers were still outside, talking and smoking, but the eerie feeling that something was about to happen gripped me. I glanced at the clock. It had been 20 minutes since I called the cops. Just as I started to wonder if they'd arrive in time, one of the truckers walked back toward the rig where the first girl sat. He opened the door and said something to her, but she didn't move. I swallowed hard, feeling the tension rise. The second truck started its engine, and I realized they were getting ready to leave. Panic surged through me. What if the authorities didn't make it in time? I couldn't let them drive away with those girls. I stepped outside, hoping to buy some time. I casually asked if they needed anything else, trying to act normal, but inside, I was shaking with fear. The trucker gave me a cold look, his eyes narrowing as if he could sense I knew something. My heart pounded in my chest, but just then, flashing lights appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me as the police cars pulled into the lot, their sirens cutting through the eerie silence of the night. The truckers froze, realizing they had been caught. The officers quickly moved in, blocking the exits. What followed was chaotic. The police approached the trucks, asking questions and ordering the men out of the vehicles. The girls were taken aside, trembling but finally safe. It turned out that my suspicions had been right. The men were part of a human trafficking ring, and the girls had been abducted. They had been forced to travel from one state to another, hidden in plain sight at truck stops like this one. Even though I felt a wave of relief knowing that those girls had been rescued, the experience was haunting. The eerie quiet of the truck stop, the chilling look in those girls' eyes, it all stuck with me. I realized how easy it is for something so terrible to happen right under our noses. I've worked the night shift for years, but after that night, I saw everything differently. The quiet wasn't comforting anymore. It was full of hidden dangers. I still think about those girls sometimes, wondering what might have happened if I hadn't made that call. The thought sends shivers down my spine. It's terrifying to know how close evil can be, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment when no one is paying attention. The Ozarks had always been a place of peace for us, a sanctuary where we could escape the noise of the city and lose ourselves in nature. My partner and I had been camping there for years, and this trip was no different. At least, it didn't start that way. We set up camp deep in the forest, away from the main trails, where the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional call of an owl. It was the perfect getaway, or so we thought. The first sign that something was wrong came at dusk. We were sitting by the fire, enjoying the quiet, when we heard gunshots in the distance. At first, we thought it might be hunters, but hunting season wasn't for another few months. The sound was chilling, breaking the peaceful silence we'd grown so used to. My partner and I exchanged uneasy glances, but decided to stay put. After all, we were far from any hunting grounds, and the shots were distant, at least for now. That night, the air felt different, heavier somehow. There was a strange unease between us, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. Around midnight, we heard more gunshots, much closer this time, followed by the eerie sound of voices, men talking and laughing, their words distorted by the wind. My stomach knotted with dread. Whoever they weren't hunters. We knew we needed to stay quiet and keep the fire low. Something about their presence sent chills down my spine. We tried to sleep, but the voices and gunshots persisted throughout the night, getting closer. Early the next morning, we decided to break camp and head back to the main trail. We packed up quickly, the eerie feeling growing with each passing minute. As we walked through the forest, the sounds of birds chirping and leaves crunching underfoot seemed to return some of the peace, but it didn't last. Suddenly, we stumbled upon something we weren't supposed to see. Two men standing over a deer carcass, their rifles slung over their shoulders. The men turned toward us, their eyes cold and calculating. For a moment, none of us moved, the tension thick in the air. It was clear these weren't legal hunters. They were poachers, and we had just walked right into their territory. My partner and I backed away slowly, but the look on their faces told us we wouldn't be leaving easily. One of the men raised his rifle, his expression chilling. "Where do you think you're going?" he growled. Fear shot through me like ice. We turned and ran, not waiting for them to follow. The sound of their footsteps crashing through the underbrush echoed behind us, along with the occasional gunshot that whizzed terrifyingly close to our heads. The forest, once a place of refuge, had turned into a deadly maze. Every tree, every rock felt like an obstacle as we ran blindly, our only goal to get as far away from them as possible. We didn't stop running until we found a thick grove of trees to hide in. Our breaths were ragged, our hearts pounding as we crouched behind the trees, trying to stay silent. The poachers were still searching for us, their voices drifting through the forest like a haunting whisper. "We can't let them get away," one of them muttered. My blood ran cold at the sound. They were determined to find us. We stayed hidden for what felt like hours, barely daring to move. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. The sun was beginning to set again, casting long shadows through the trees, and the eerie darkness was creeping back in. I could feel my partner trembling beside me. We knew we couldn't stay there all night. We had to reach the ranger station before it was too late. Just as the last light of day faded, we made our move. We crept quietly through the forest, keeping low and using the trees as cover. My heart raced with every step, the fear of being caught keeping us on edge. The sounds of the poachers faded into the distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still close, watching, waiting. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, and every second felt like a battle between survival and terror. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we spotted the ranger station in the distance. Relief washed over me, but we couldn't relax just yet. We bolted toward it, our legs aching, lungs burning. The door slammed shut behind us as we rushed inside, gasping for breath. We frantically explained what had happened to the rangers, who immediately contacted the authorities. We had made it out alive, but just barely. The next morning, the rangers informed us that they had found signs of illegal poaching activity, but no trace of the men. They had vanished into the forest, leaving behind a haunting reminder of how quickly a peaceful camping trip could turn into a nightmare. We never saw the poachers again, but the memory of that chase, the fear, the gunshots, the feeling of being hunted, still lingers. Even now, whenever I step into the forest, that chilling sense of danger creeps back in. The Ozarks, once our sanctuary, have become a place where the line between safety and terror is far too thin. I'd been fishing on Lake Erie for years, but nothing prepared me for the eerie night when I encountered the ghost ship. It was a calm evening, and I was out alone on my small boat, enjoying the quiet and the peaceful lapping of the water against the hull. The lake had always been a place where I could clear my mind, but that night there was something different in the air. A chill ran down my spine, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog began to roll in thick and fast, swallowing everything around me. Visibility dropped to nearly nothing, and soon I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I was about to turn back when I heard it. The faint sound of a bell clanging in the distance. It echoed through the fog, haunting and out of place. I strained my eyes trying to see where it was coming from, but the fog was too dense. That's when I saw it, barely visible through the mist. A massive ship looming in the distance. At first, I thought it was just another freighter, but something about it seemed off. The ship looked old, its hull covered in rust and barnacles, its masts towering high above the lake, creaking as they swayed in the wind. A strange feeling settled over me as I watched it drift closer, its sails tattered and torn. I hadn't seen any ships like this on the lake before, and as it came into view, the name etched into the bow sent a chill through me. Edmund Fitzgerald. The Edmund Fitzgerald had sunk decades ago during a storm on Lake Superior, taking its entire crew with it. But here it was, right in front of me, drifting silently through the fog on Lake Erie. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Could it be some kind of memorial ship? No, that didn't make sense. This ship looked abandoned, its decks empty, its windows shattered. As I sat there staring at the ghostly vessel, I heard something even more unsettling, a faint cry for help. It sounded distant, as if it was coming from somewhere deep within the ship. My first instinct was to turn the boat around and get as far away from the Fitzgerald as possible, but something about the cries drew me in. Against my better judgment, I started the engine and steered my boat closer to the ship. The eerie cries grew louder as I approached, filling the air with a haunting sense of desperation. I knew the Edmund Fitzgerald had lost all hands, and yet it felt like there were souls still trapped aboard, calling out to anyone who would listen. My hands shook as I threw a line onto the ship and climbed aboard, the deck creaking under my weight. The fog pressed in around me, and I could barely see a few feet ahead. I wandered through the empty corridors, the wind howling through the broken windows. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and decay, and every step echoed in the eerie silence. The cries had stopped, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. It felt like the ship was alive, its metal walls groaning as if trying to warn me away. But I couldn't leave, not yet. I had to find the source of those cries. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty, fog-filled deck. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickened my pace, moving deeper into the ship. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and I could feel the cold presence of something, or someone, following me. The walls seemed to close in, the narrow hallways twisting and turning, leading me deeper into the belly of the ship. And then I saw them. Shadows moved through the fog, figures with hollow eyes and pale faces. They were the crew, the lost souls of the Edmund Fitzgerald, still trapped aboard the ship. Their eyes locked on me, and I could feel their pain, their anger, their desperation. My breath caught in my throat as they slowly moved toward me, their hands reaching out. I backed away, my mind racing with fear. I had to get off the ship, but the way back was blocked by the eerie, shifting shadows. The cries returned, louder this time, almost deafening. The ship groaned and shuddered, as if it was sinking again, pulling me down with it. Panic surged through me as I ran back to the deck, my heart racing, my body trembling. I could feel the ship trying to pull me under, dragging me into its haunted depths. Just as the shadows closed in, I leaped off the side, splashing into the freezing water below. I swam as fast as I could, my lungs burning as I pushed toward my boat. The cries still echoed in my ears. The haunting images of the lost crew seared into my mind. I climbed aboard, gasping for breath, and started the engine, speeding away from the Fitzgerald as fast as I could. The ship disappeared into the fog behind me, its eerie presence fading into the night. When I finally made it back to shore, I was shaken to my core. The ghost ship, the cries for help, the souls of the crew, it all felt too real to be a hallucination. I tried to tell myself it was just the fog playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew the truth. The Edmund Fitzgerald still sailed the waters of the Great Lakes, its crew forever trapped in a chilling, haunting existence, waiting for the next soul to board. The Halloween masquerade party was supposed to be the highlight of the year. Held at an old mansion on the outskirts of town, it promised an unforgettable night of mystery, fun, and a touch of the eerie. I arrived with my friends, all of us dressed in elaborate costumes, our faces hidden behind ornate masks. The mansion itself was impressive, with its Gothic architecture, dimly lit corridors, and flickering candlelight that gave the whole place a hauntingly beautiful atmosphere. But as the night went on, the party turned into something far more sinister than we could have ever imagined. The host, a man none of us knew personally, but who had a reputation for throwing extravagant parties, greeted us in a sleek black mask, his identity hidden beneath it. He had an unsettling presence, but we brushed it off, figuring he was just getting into the spooky spirit of the night. The mansion was packed with guests, all wearing masks that ranged from elegant to grotesque. The eerie air of mystery only added to the excitement, at least at first. As the evening wore on, the host gathered everyone in the grand ballroom for what he called the main event. We thought it was just a party game, a harmless way to entertain us, but when he announced that we were about to play a deadly version of hide and seek, the mood in the room shifted. The air grew colder, the playful chatter died down, and an uneasy tension settled over the guests. He explained the rules with chilling precision, those who were caught by the masked hunters would face serious consequences. Most of us laughed it off, assuming it was all just part of the theatrics. But then, the host's voice turned dark, almost menacing. He locked the doors, trapping us inside, and the masked hunters, figures in black cloaks and grotesque masks, emerged from the shadows, armed with weapons that gleamed ominously in the candlelight. My stomach dropped as I realized this wasn't a game. This was real, and we were in serious danger. Panic erupted as the guests scattered, trying to find places to hide. I grabbed my friend's hand and bolted out of the ballroom, our hearts racing as we sprinted down one of the mansion's long, narrow hallways. Behind us, we could hear the eerie laughter of the masked hunters, their footsteps echoing through the halls as they began their deadly chase. The mansion, once a place of beauty, had transformed into a labyrinth of terror. We ducked into a darkened room, our breaths ragged as we pressed ourselves against the wall. The sounds of footsteps grew closer, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. My friend squeezed my hand, her eyes wide with fear. We had no idea who was behind the masks, and we didn't want to stick around to find out. The door creaked open slowly, and we held our breath, praying the hunter wouldn't find us. Suddenly, one of the hunters lunged into the room, their mask grotesque and chilling. Without thinking, we bolted again, narrowly avoiding the swing of their weapon. We tore through the mansion, our fear growing with every step. The other guests were scattered, some hiding, others desperately running. The atmosphere had become suffocating, every flickering shadow a potential threat, every creak of the floorboard sending chills down my spine. We found ourselves in the mansion's maze-like garden, surrounded by tall hedges and dimly lit by lanterns. It felt like the perfect place to hide, but also a perfect trap. We split up, hoping to throw off the hunters, but I immediately regretted it. Alone, the eerie silence of the garden was overwhelming. Every rustle of the leaves making my pulse quicken. I could hear faint screams in the distance, the hunters getting closer. I crouched behind one of the hedges, trying to steady my breath, but the chilling sound of footsteps on the gravel path sent a wave of fear through me. One of the hunters was near. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe as their shadow passed by, the eerie glow of their lantern casting long shadows on the ground. My heart raced as I realized how close I was to being caught. Just when I thought they had moved on, the hunter's mask appeared around the corner, their eyes locking on mine. Panic surged through me, and I sprinted through the maze, the hunter close behind. The cold night air stunned my lungs as I ran, weaving through the hedges, desperately trying to escape. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but the mansion and its grounds felt endless, like a twisted game I couldn't win. I finally reached the edge of the garden, bursting through the hedge and stumbling back into the mansion. The grand staircase loomed ahead of me, and I took it 2 steps at a time and took forward, my legs burning with exhaustion. The ballroom was just ahead, but I knew it was still locked. The host was waiting there, watching, his dark mask blending with the shadows. He smiled as I approached, as if he knew I wouldn't escape. In a last-ditch effort, I veered off into a side hallway, finding a hidden servant's exit that led to the back of the mansion. I threw open the door and ran out into the night, the cold air biting at my skin as I fled down the long, winding driveway. Behind me, I could hear the hunter's footsteps growing fainter. I didn't stop running until I reached the road, where I flagged down a passing car. I escaped, but I never saw my friends again. The police investigated the mansion, but I'd always loved hiking in the remote Cascade Mountains, where the air was crisp and the trails were empty. It felt like an escape from the chaos of everyday life, a chance to clear my head and enjoy the solitude. That day started like any other, with the sun shining and the forest stretching out ahead of me. I had the trail all to myself, or so I thought. Little did I know, I was about to stumble upon something that would turn my peaceful hike into a terrifying fight for survival. The first thing that struck me as odd was the smell. It was faint at first, like something rotting deep in the underbrush. I tried to ignore it, thinking it might just be a dead animal, but as I continued hiking, the stench grew stronger, more nauseating. My curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to investigate. I veered off the trail, pushing through the thick trees and overgrown brush, following the sickening odor. That's when I saw it. A shallow grave, freshly dug, the dirt still loose and disturbed. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just a random spot in the forest. Someone had buried something here. My stomach churned as I leaned in closer, noticing what looked like the corner of a tarp peeking out from the earth. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was no animal grave. This was a dumping ground. Panic surged through me as I backed away, my mind racing. Who had done this, and were they still nearby? I felt exposed, vulnerable, and the once peaceful forest suddenly seemed dangerous, every shadow a potential threat. I needed to get out of there fast. I turned to head back to the trail, but before I could take more than a few steps, I heard it. A voice, low and menacing, coming from somewhere behind me. "I wouldn't go any further if I were you," the voice said, sending a chill down my spine. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly I turned around, and there he was. A man, standing at the edge of the trees watching me. His eyes were cold, calculating, and in his hand he held a shovel, caked with dirt. My breath caught in my throat as the horrifying truth dawned on me. He was the one who had buried the bodies. I didn't wait for him to make the first move. I bolted, running as fast as I could through the trees, branches whipping at my face and arms. I could hear him chasing after me, his footsteps heavy and relentless. The forest, once my refuge, had become a labyrinth of fear. My lungs burned as I ran, but I couldn't stop. I knew that if he caught me, I'd end up in one of those graves. I stumbled through the dense forest, barely able to see the trail ahead. My body was screaming for rest, but the sound of his footsteps behind me kept me going. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't afford to lose focus. The forest seemed endless, every tree and bush looking the same, and I had no idea if I was even running in the right direction anymore. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. Just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I spotted a rocky outcrop up ahead. Without thinking, I scrambled toward it, hoping to find a place to hide. The rocks jutted out over a small ravine, and I squeezed myself into a narrow crevice between them, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I could hear him coming, his footsteps slower now, more deliberate, as if he knew I was close. The seconds felt like hours as I crouched in the darkness, trying to control my breathing. I could hear him muttering to himself, cursing under his breath as he searched the area. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I pressed myself deeper into the rocks, praying he would move on. But then the footsteps stopped. He was standing right above me. For what felt like an eternity, he stood there, his shadow stretching over the rocks. I didn't move a muscle, my body frozen in fear. Then finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. I stayed hidden for a long time after that, too terrified to move. When I was sure he was gone, I crawled out from the rocks, my legs weak and shaky. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead. My car was still parked where I'd left it, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling as I unlocked the door. As I sped away from the mountains, the terror of what had just happened finally hit me. I had come within inches of death, and the thought of ending up in one of those graves sent a wave of nausea through me. I reported the incident to the authorities, but by the time they searched the area, the man was long gone. They found the graves, though, several of them, scattered throughout the forest. I still think about that day, about how close I came to being buried in the remote wilderness, with no one ever knowing what had happened to me. The forest, once a place of solace, is now a haunting reminder of the evil that can lurk just beneath the surface. It all started with a dare. My friends and I had always been into urban exploration, and when we heard about the old abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, we couldn't resist. The place had been shut down decades ago, and rumors swirled about the eerie things that happened inside. Experimental treatments gone wrong, patients who had never left. It was the perfect mix of mystery and horror. Against my better judgment, I agreed to join them for a night of exploring. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. We arrived just before midnight, flashlights in hand, and the asylum loomed over us like a forgotten relic of the past. Its windows were shattered, vines crawled up its crumbling walls, and an eerie stillness surrounded the building. The gate was rusted, creaking loudly as we pushed it open. The moment we stepped inside, a chill settled over me, but I shook it off. I wasn't going to be the one to back out first. The inside was even worse. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. Peeling wallpaper and broken furniture filled the rooms, and every step we took echoed through the empty halls. My flashlight beam flickered over old medical equipment, rusted gurneys, cracked tiles, and chains hanging from the ceiling. It felt like the asylum had been abandoned in a hurry, as if everyone had just up and left one day. The eerie atmosphere gnawed at my nerves, but we pressed on. As we ventured deeper into the asylum, strange things started happening. At first, it was just little things, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a door creaking open by itself. But then we heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the hallways. We froze, our hearts pounding. No one else was supposed to be here. I glanced at my friends, hoping one of them would say it was just the wind, but the look on their faces told me they were just as terrified as I was. The footsteps grew louder, and I could feel my pulse quickening. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The asylum was supposed to be abandoned, but it didn't feel that way. We moved forward cautiously, sticking close together as the hallway stretched out ahead of us. The air grew colder, and a strange sense of dread settled over me, like we were being watched. Then we saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway, shrouded in darkness. It was impossible to make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on us. My stomach dropped, and an eerie silence filled the air. None of us moved, too scared to even breathe. The figure didn't move either, just stood there watching us. My skin prickled with fear as I realized this wasn't a prank. There was someone, inside the asylum with us. We turned to run, but the hallways twisted and turned in ways I couldn't understand. It was like the building itself had changed, trapping us inside. Every corridor led to another dead end, and the figure seemed to follow us, always just out of sight, always there. My heart raced as we stumbled through the dark, trying to find the exit. The air felt thick, oppressive, and the eerie sound of whispers filled the space around us. I couldn't make out the words, but they chilled me to the bone. In one of the rooms, we found an old patient's journal, half buried under debris. The pages were yellowed and torn, but the writing was frantic, desperate. It spoke of shadows, of spirits haunting the asylum, of patients who had never really left. As I read, the whispers grew louder, and I could feel a presence closing in. My friends were just as panicked, frantically searching for a way out, but the asylum seemed to be playing with us, keeping us trapped inside its haunted walls. The figure appeared again, this time closer. We ran, hearts pounding in our chests, but it was no use. The asylum was a maze, and every turn felt like we were going deeper into its dark heart. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. I could hear my friends shouting, but their voices seemed distant, muffled by the oppressive air. The whispers were deafening now, like they were inside my head, and I felt the presence drawing closer. Finally, we found the main hallway, the one leading back to the entrance. Relief surged through me as I saw the faint outline of the door ahead. We sprinted toward it, not daring to look back. My legs burned with exhaustion, but I pushed through, my only thought to get out of that cursed place. The moment we burst through the door and into the night air, the whispers stopped and the oppressive weight lifted from my chest. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, breathless and shaking. As we sped away, I looked back at the asylum, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched still clung to me. None of us spoke on the ride home, the weight of what had happened too heavy to put into words. I still don't know what we encountered in that asylum, but I'll never go back. The next day, we researched the history of the asylum. It turned out that several patients had died there under mysterious circumstances, and there were rumors of cruel experiments conducted in secret. Some say their spirits still linger, trapped in the building, haunting anyone who dares to enter. After that night, I believe it. Whatever was in there with us, it wasn't just a ghost story. It was real, and it was watching. Hiking alone in a national park was something I had done dozens of times before. There was a certain peace in being surrounded by nature, with nothing but the sounds of birds and the wind rustling through the trees. That day started like any other. I set out early, eager to explore a new trail that wound deep into the heart of the forest. The sun filtered through the tall trees, casting long shadows on the path ahead of me. But as I walked, the air began to feel heavier, more still than usual. It was subtle at first, but soon enough, the peaceful hike turned into something far more chilling. About an hour into the hike, I noticed that the usual sounds of the forest had quieted. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence that pressed in from all sides. I tried to shrug it off, but the further I went, the more oppressive the silence became. The trees, which had once felt welcoming, now seemed to loom over me, their branches twisting like dark fingers. I was starting to feel uneasy, and for the first time, I wondered if I should turn back. Then I heard it. A strange, low growl echoing through the trees. At first I thought it might be a bear, but something about the sound wasn't right. It was too deep, too inhuman. My heart raced as I stood frozen, straining to hear where it was coming from. The growl came again, closer this time, sending a shiver down my spine. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something I wanted to meet. I decided it was time to head back, but when I turned, the path behind me seemed different, as if the forest had shifted while I wasn't looking. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the eerie feeling that was growing inside me. Every crack of a twig, every shadow seemed to move in the corner of my vision. My breath came faster, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then I saw it, a figure, just barely visible through the trees, watching me. It was tall, humanoid, but there was something grotesquely wrong about its shape. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the shadows, locked onto mine, and a chill ran through my entire body. Panic surged through me, and I started running, not caring where the trail led anymore, just desperate to put as much distance between me and the creature as possible. My legs burned as I sprinted through the forest, dodging branches and roots that seemed to reach out, trying to trip me. Behind me, I could hear the creature moving, its growls growing louder, more menacing. The eerie silence of the forest was now broken by the sound of my frantic footsteps and the beast's relentless pursuit. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its presence getting closer. The forest, once a place of refuge, had become a twisted nightmare. My lungs burned with every breath, but I couldn't stop. The growling grew louder, echoing off the trees, as if the creature was playing with me, toying with its prey. The path ahead was a blur, and I could barely think, my mind consumed with the single thought of survival. Finally, I stumbled upon a small ravine, its steep walls covered in jagged rocks. I had no choice but to jump. The fall was rough, and I landed hard on the other side, rolling down the slope until I hit the bottom. My body ached, but I didn't have time to feel the pain. I scrambled to my feet, searching for a place to hide. Nearby, there was a large fallen tree with a hollowed-out center. Without thinking, I dove inside, pulling myself into the dark, narrow space. The forest went eerily silent again. I held my breath, every muscle tense as I waited, listening for the creature. I could hear it pacing above the ravine, growling softly, as if searching for me. The fear was overwhelming, and I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from making any noise. Minutes felt like hours as the creature circled the area, its heavy footsteps echoing in the stillness. I prayed it wouldn't find me. After what felt like an eternity, the growling faded, and I dared to peek out from the hollow tree. The creature was gone, at least for now. I crawled out, my legs shaky, and looked around, trying to gather my bearings. The ravine had thrown me off the trail, and I had no idea which way would lead me back. But staying there wasn't an option. I had to keep moving. I spent the next several hours stumbling through the forest, every snap of a twig making my heart race, every shadow sending waves of panic through me. The forest no longer felt familiar. It felt alive, watching me, waiting for the creature to return. I could feel the weight of the beast's presence, even if I couldn't see it. The sun was starting to set, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees, and I knew I needed to find my way out before nightfall. Just as the last light began to fade, I spotted the trailhead in the distance. Relief flooded over me, but I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my car. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back as I sped away from the park, desperate to leave that terrifying encounter behind. Even now, I can't shake the memory of those glowing eyes, the inhuman growl that echoed through the trees. The forest, once my sanctuary, now feels like a place of terror. And somewhere out there, in the dark depths of the woods, that creature still lurks, waiting for its next victim. Living in the quiet suburbs was supposed to be safe, predictable, and comfortable. The kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. I'd moved into my new house a few months ago, thinking it was the perfect place to settle down. The neighbors were friendly, the lawns were perfectly manicured, and the streets were always quiet after dark. But things took a dark turn when I started noticing strange activity coming from my neighbor's house. It started small, lights flickering on and off late at night, odd noises that didn't quite fit with the calm atmosphere of the neighborhood. At first I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe they were just night owls. But then I saw him, my neighbor, carrying something large and wrapped in a tarp to his backyard shed in the dead of night. The way he moved, the eerie silence of it all, sent chills down my spine. My mind raced with possibilities, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I told myself to mind my own business, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. A few days later, I saw him again, this time digging in the backyard in the middle of the night. The eerie glow of his flashlight illuminated the scene, and I felt a growing sense of dread. What was he doing? And why at such an odd hour? I tried to rationalize it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to start watching more closely. One night, I stayed up late, keeping an eye on his house from my window. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, but just after midnight I saw him again. This time he wasn't alone. There was someone else with him, but I couldn't make out their face. They both entered the shed, and after what felt like hours, only my neighbor came out. The other person was nowhere to be seen. My heart raced as I realized that something was seriously wrong. What had happened to the other person? I knew I should have called the police, but I hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if I was jumping to conclusions? I convinced myself to wait, to see if there was any more strange behavior. But the next night, I made a terrifying discovery. As I was getting ready for bed, I saw my neighbor staring directly at my house from his window. The sight sent a chill through me. Had he noticed I'd been watching him? The way he stood there, motionless, was unsettling. It felt like a silent warning. The next day, I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt his eyes on me. The once peaceful suburban streets now felt sinister, every shadow hiding potential danger. Then, one night, I heard a noise outside my window, a faint scraping sound that sent my heart pounding. I peeked through the blinds, and there he was, standing in my backyard, staring up at my window. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze. I was trapped. Panic surged through me as I backed away from the window. My mind raced with fear. What did he want? Why was he watching me? I grabbed my phone to call the police, but when I looked back outside, he was gone. The yard was empty, but the eerie feeling that something terrible was about to happen lingered in the air. I didn't sleep at all that night, every creak of the house sending waves of terror through me. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. I tried to go about my normal routine, but I was constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him lurking nearby. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I started avoiding going outside altogether. But then, one evening, I made a horrifying discovery. I found a note taped to my front door. It read, "I know you've been watching me. Now, I'm watching you." That was the moment I knew I had to act. I called the police and reported everything. The strange behavior, the late-night digging, the person who never came back from the shed. They promised to investigate, but deep down, I knew it might already be too late. The night after I called, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying to open my back door. My heart raced as I grabbed a kitchen knife, desperate to protect myself. I could hear the doorknob turning, the slow creak of the door as it was pushed open. I didn't wait to see who it was. I bolted out the front door, running as fast as I could down the street, my pulse pounding in my ears. I made it to a neighbor's house and pounded on the door, breathless and terrified. When they let me in, I called the police again, my hands shaking. They arrived within minutes, but by the time they searched my house, the intruder, my neighbor, was gone. They found disturbing evidence in his shed. Bloodstains, tools, and personal belongings that didn't belong to him. It turned out that my neighbor was indeed dangerous, a suspected serial killer who had been operating under the radar for years. He had used the quiet suburban neighborhood as his hunting ground, blending in with the normalcy of everyday life while hiding his horrific crimes. The police never found him, and to this day, he's still out there somewhere. I moved away from that suburb as soon as I could, but the memory of those terrifying nights will never leave me. The quiet streets, the perfectly kept lawns, and the eerie silence that once felt comforting now haunt my every thought. Sometimes when I walk down a quiet street in my new neighborhood, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike again. I had always enjoyed late-night drives, just me, the open road, and the hum of my engine under the stars. That night, I was driving down a remote highway, the kind where you don't see another car for miles. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, and I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't long before I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror, a single car far behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. People drive at night all the time. But then, something about the car's movements caught my attention. The driver was following closely, almost tailgating, even though the road was completely empty. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over me, but the car stayed too close for comfort. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us, but the headlights only grew brighter, matching my speed. That's when I realized I was being followed. My pulse quickened, and my grip tightened on the steering wheel. It was just the two of us on the highway, and the situation was turning from eerie to outright terrifying. The car swerved into the other lane, then back again, as if testing my reactions. I glanced in the mirror and saw the silhouette of the driver, a dark figure behind the wheel, expression unreadable. My heart raced as the car edged closer, trying to force me off the road. Panic surged through me, but I knew I couldn't pull over. That was exactly what they wanted. Instead, I pressed harder on the gas, speeding down the empty highway, hoping to lose them on the back roads. I veered off onto a side road, hoping the narrow lanes and sharp turns would give me the advantage. But the driver followed, their car roaring behind mine as if it were a predator hunting its prey. The road twisted and turned, the trees closing in on either side, casting long shadows in my headlights. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to keep control of the car. Every sharp turn, every glance in the mirror showed the other car getting closer, their aggression growing more and more chilling. Just when I thought I couldn't keep it up any longer, I saw something up ahead, a police checkpoint. Relief washed over me, but the driver didn't seem to care. They revved the engine, getting even closer, as if determined to finish what they started. I swerved wildly, the car brushing against the edge of the road as I struggled to maintain control. The police lights flashed in the distance, offering a brief glimmer of hope. I sped through the checkpoint, and the police immediately signaled for me to stop. I pulled over, heart pounding, and watched as the car behind me slammed on the brakes, tires screeching. But instead of stopping, the driver reversed and sped off into the night, disappearing down a side road before the police could react. I tried to explain what had happened, my voice shaky, but the officers looked baffled. It was as if the stalker had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. The police escorted me back onto the highway, but the fear lingered. Even after I was safe, I couldn't shake the image of those headlights in my mirror, the car swerving dangerously behind me. It was a haunting reminder of how quickly things can go from ordinary to terrifying. The eerie silence of the highway that had once felt so peaceful now felt suffocating. I couldn't get home fast enough. That night changed everything for me. I never drive those remote highways alone anymore, especially not at night. The thought of being followed, of that chilling car suddenly appearing behind me again, keeps me on edge. Sometimes, when I'm out late, I find myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights tailing me once more. I was lucky to escape that night, but the memory of the chase still haunts me. When I bought the old house, I knew it needed some work, but I was excited to make it my own. It had that rustic charm you find in older homes, with creaky floorboards and little nooks that gave it character. I'd been renovating for a few weeks when I discovered something strange. While knocking down a wall in the living room, I found a hidden door. It wasn't on the house plans, and it looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to see what was behind it. The door led to a narrow staircase, descending into what I assumed was a long-forgotten basement. The air was thick and musty, and every step I took sent echoes bouncing off the stone walls. I shone my flashlight around and saw remnants of an old life. Dusty furniture, broken shelves, and scattered belongings that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. It felt eerie, like I was walking into someone's personal history, long abandoned and left to rot in the dark. As I ventured deeper into the basement, I noticed something odd. The furniture wasn't just old. It was arranged as if someone had been living there. There was a chair facing an old television set, a table with rotting food on it, and even a bed in the corner, still made as though someone had left in a hurry. The scene sent a chill down my spine, but what unsettled me the most was a small collection of photographs pinned to the wall. They were old, faded images of a man, the previous owner, but in each photo his face was scratched out, leaving only a haunting outline. I started to back away, the unsettling atmosphere growing heavier with each step. That's when I heard it, a faint, eerie whisper, barely audible but definitely there. My breath caught in my throat as I shone the flashlight toward the sound. The light flickered, casting shadows that danced on the stone walls. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just the wind or the old house settling, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Something about this basement wasn't right. As I turned to leave, I heard a loud slam behind me. The door had closed on its own, and no matter how hard I pushed, it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. My heart raced, and I pounded on the door, but the heavy wood didn't move. The basement, which had felt eerie before, now felt suffocating. The air grew colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone down there. Shadows seemed to shift around me, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I fumbled with my phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. The walls of the house seemed to close in, and the only light I had was the flickering beam from my dying flashlight. My mind raced as I tried to figure out how to escape. The photos on the wall caught my eye again, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. One of the scratched-out faces looked eerily like mine. My stomach dropped as I realized the man in the photos had been trapped here too. Desperation took over, and I started searching the basement for another way out. I found a small window high up on the wall, but it was sealed shut, the glass too thick to break. The whispers turned into soft laughter, chilling and eerie, like whoever, or whatever, was down here was toying with me. My flashlight flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I could feel the presence now, a cold, haunting weight pressing down on me from all sides. The laughter grew louder, and I could hear footsteps shuffling through the dark, getting closer. My pulse pounded in my ears as I backed into a corner, trying to keep my breathing steady. I felt a cold draft brush against my neck, as if something was standing right behind me, just out of sight. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the creak of the door slowly opening. Light flooded in from the stairwell, and I didn't waste a second. I bolted up the stairs, my legs shaking as I stumbled into the living room. I slammed the hidden door shut behind me, breathing heavily as I tried to calm down. The whispers were gone, but the chilling memory of what had just happened lingered. I never went back into that basement again. I ended up sealing the door, covering it with drywall, and trying to forget it ever existed. But every now and then, late at night, I swear I can still hear those faint whispers echoing from somewhere deep within the house. The unsettling presence that I felt down there never really left. I've learned to live with it, but the thought of that dark basement and the photos with scratched out faces still haunts me. A summer vacation at a secluded lake cabin sounded like the perfect escape for my family. We'd been looking forward to getting away from the busy city and enjoying some peace and quiet. The cabin itself was picturesque, sitting right on the edge of the lake, surrounded by thick trees. It had that old rustic charm, and the view from the porch was stunning, just the calming waters of the lake stretching out before us. At first, everything was perfect, but soon things started to feel off. The first strange occurrence happened on our second night. We were sitting around the fire when we heard something, faint whispers carried on the wind. At first, we brushed it off as the wind rustling through the trees, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was as if voices were whispering, just out of earshot, too low to make out, but eerie enough to send a chill through all of us. My wife suggested it might be echoes from another cabin across the lake, but there weren't any nearby. The sound seemed to be coming from the woods. The next morning, while exploring the cabin, I noticed something strange. There was a door tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway, partially hidden behind an old bookshelf. The door was locked, and there was no key in sight. It felt odd, like someone had deliberately tried to keep it hidden. My curiosity got the best of me, and after some effort, I managed to pry the door open. What I found inside was disturbing, to say the least. It was a small room, barely big enough to stand in. The walls were covered in strange symbols, crudely painted in dark red. At the center of the room sat a small altar, surrounded by old, dusty candles. Scattered around the floor were faded photographs, pictures of people, but their faces had been scratched out. My stomach turned as I realized that whoever had owned this cabin before us had been involved in something sinister. This was no ordinary vacation spot. I quickly shut the door and moved the bookshelf back in place, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled over me. That night, the whispering returned, louder this time, and accompanied by soft knocking sounds on the cabin walls. My children, normally sound sleepers, woke up terrified, claiming they'd heard someone walking outside their window. I checked, but there was no one there. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The following day, we decided to cut the trip short, but strange things continued to happen. The power flickered on and off throughout the day, and objects seemed to move on their own. Small things at first, like a glass on the counter or a book on the table. But then we discovered something that made my blood run cold. My daughter found a journal hidden under one of the beds, and its contents revealed the dark history of the cabin. The journal belonged to a member of a cult that had used the cabin as a meeting place decades ago. They had practiced strange rituals, believing that the lake held some kind of ancient power. According to the journal, they had made sacrifices to the lake spirit, and several people had gone missing during their time there. The final entry was hastily written, warning that the spirit was restless and would claim anyone who disturbed its sanctuary. As I read the journal, the whispers grew louder, as if the cabin itself was trying to warn us. The atmosphere became suffocating. The once peaceful surroundings now felt haunted by something far more sinister. That night, the knocking returned, this time accompanied by shadowy figures moving outside the cabin. We huddled together, too terrified to sleep, waiting for dawn to break. It felt like we were trapped, with no escape from whatever dark force was closing in on us. By morning, we were packed and ready to leave, but as we stepped outside, the lake looked different. The water, once calm and inviting, now seemed dark and ominous, like it was hiding something beneath the surface. The trees around the cabin seemed to close in, casting eerie shadows that made the hairs on my neck stand up. We didn't waste any time. We got into the car and drove away, leaving the cabin and its dark secrets behind. Even after we returned home, the events of that weekend haunted us. We tried to put it behind us, but strange things continued to happen. Flickering lights, unexplained noises in the house. It was as if we had brought something back with us, a remnant of the cabin's dark history. I don't know if it's the lake spirit or something else, but I can still hear the whispers at night, growing louder with each passing day. I've tried to find out more about the cabin's history, but records are scarce. All I know is that something terrible happened there, and whatever it was, it hasn't left. The lake cabin was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, but it turned into a fight for our sanity. Now, even the thought of returning to that place fills me with dread. The cabin may be far behind us, but its chilling presence is something we'll never truly escape. We'd all heard the rumors about the abandoned playground on the edge of town. It was the kind of place parents warned their kids to stay away from, a relic of the past left to rot. They said a child had died there years ago, and that's why it was closed off. But as teenagers, we didn't believe in ghost stories. We were just looking for a thrill. So one night, my friends and I decided to sneak in and see if there was any truth to the chilling tales. The playground was exactly what we expected. Old, rusted equipment covered in graffiti, weeds growing up through the cracked asphalt. The swings creaked in the wind, and the seesaw sat tilted as if it hadn't been touched in decades. It was eerie, but nothing more than an empty lot. We laughed about the stories, joking about ghosts and how ridiculous it all was. But as the night went on, the atmosphere shifted, and it started to feel like we weren't alone. It began with a soft sound, almost like distant giggling. At first, we thought one of us was playing a prank, but the laughter grew louder, echoing through the night. It was unmistakably the sound of a child, but there was no one there. My stomach tightened, and I could see my friends growing uneasy too. The wind picked up, and the swing set started moving on its own, the rusted chains screeching in the eerie silence. That's when we saw the figure, small and shadowy, standing at the far end of the playground near the old merry-go-round. It was just a shape at first, barely visible in the dim light, but as we stared, it started moving. Slowly, it crept toward us, its outline becoming clearer. It looked like a child, but there was something wrong about the way it moved, something unnatural. My heart pounded in my chest as we stood frozen, unable to believe what we were seeing. One of my friends called out, but the figure didn't respond. It just kept coming, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it wasn't walking but being pulled by something. The giggling grew louder, more distorted, filling the air around us. We backed away, our fear mounting as the figure got closer. There was no mistaking it now. This was no prank, no trick of the light. Something was haunting that playground, and it wanted us to leave. In a panic, we turned and ran, but the figure seemed to follow, always just behind us. The playground felt like a maze, the old equipment looming in the darkness, casting long shadows that made it impossible to see where we were going. The laughter echoed all around us, chilling and relentless. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the shadowy figure was there, moving closer, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. We reached the fence and scrambled to climb over it, our hands trembling as we fumbled with the rusted metal. Just as I hoisted myself up, I felt something cold brush against my ankle, a sensation that made my blood run cold. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We bolted toward the street, not stopping until we were far from the playground. The laughter faded, but the fear clung to us like a shadow. None of us spoke as we caught our breath, too shaken by what we'd just experienced. Later that night, we gathered at one of my friends' houses, trying to make sense of what had happened. We all saw the same thing, the shadowy figure, the eerie laughter, the feeling of being watched. But no one had any answers. The rumors about the child who died there suddenly didn't seem so far-fetched. The next morning, I did some research and found out the truth. A boy had indeed died at the playground years ago, a tragic accident on the merry-go-round. Since then, people claim to have seen his ghost, always playing near the old equipment, forever trapped in that moment. After that night, none of us ever went near the playground again. But the memory of it still haunts me, especially on quiet nights when I'm alone. Sometimes I swear I can still hear that eerie giggling, faint but unmistakable, as if the spirit of the playground has followed me. I've tried to forget it, but the chilling experience is burned into my mind. That playground was more than just abandoned, it was cursed. The thing that unsettles me the most is that the ghost didn't seem angry. It wasn't trying to hurt us. It felt like it wanted to play, like the child's spirit was still looking for someone to join him. But there was something darker, something malevolent lurking beneath that innocent facade, and I'm certain we only escaped because we ran when we did. If we'd stayed any longer, I don't know what would have happened. But one thing is for sure, I'll never go back to that playground. The storm came out of nowhere. One minute, the sky was clear, and the next, it was blackened with ominous clouds rolling in fast. I'd been working in the yard when I saw the first flash of lightning, followed by a distant rumble of thunder. The wind picked up, whipping the trees into a frenzy. It wasn't long before the rain started coming down in sheets, and I knew I had to find shelter. Fortunately, there was an old storm shelter on the property, built years before I bought the place. I figured it would be the safest place to ride out the storm. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the shelter, pulling open the heavy rusted door. It groaned as I forced it open, and I quickly descended the steps, feeling the weight of the storm bearing down. Inside, it was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. I shut the door behind me, and for a moment, the only sound was the pounding of rain above. I'd been in the shelter a few times before just to check it out, but it had never felt quite like this, so suffocating, so isolating. As I settled in, I noticed something odd. The faint sound of breathing, but it wasn't mine. I froze, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The shelter wasn't big, just a concrete room with shelves and an old cot, and there was nowhere for anyone to hide. I swept my flashlight around the small space, expecting to find nothing, but then I saw it. Movement in the far corner where the shadows were darkest. My heart skipped a beat as a figure slowly emerged from the gloom. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe something that had taken refuge in the shelter. But no, it was a person, hunched over, watching me with wide, unblinking eyes. My breath caught in my throat. How had they gotten in here? I hadn't seen anyone else around when I came in, and the shelter had been locked. Panic surged through me as the figure slowly stood up, their face hidden in shadow. There was something off about the way they moved, something unnatural and eerie. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely steady. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they took a step closer, their breathing growing heavier, more labored. The storm outside raged on, the thunder crashing so loud it rattled the walls. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was trapped in here with someone, or something, that didn't belong. The figure lunged toward me, and I barely had time to react. I stumbled back, knocking over a stack of old crates as I tried to get away. My flashlight flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When the light came back on, the figure was gone. The shelter was small, with no other exits. There was no way they could have just disappeared. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was it the storm playing tricks on me? Or was something more sinister at play? The shelter felt colder now, the air thick with an eerie presence. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on me, watching from the darkness. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pressed myself against the far wall, trying to stay calm. The figure had vanished, but I knew it was still there, lurking in the shadows. I could feel it. The storm outside was relentless, the wind howling like a beast, but inside the shelter, it was dead silent, except for that faint, labored breathing. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something or someone was holding it shut from the outside. Panic gripped me as I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my voice was swallowed by the storm. There was no way out. I was trapped underground with whatever had appeared in the shelter. My mind raced, trying to figure out how I could survive the night. The figure reappeared, this time standing in the middle of the room, closer than before. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and their face was contorted into something that barely resembled a human expression. They stepped forward again, and I could feel the air grow colder with each step they took. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in fear. It was as if the shelter itself was alive, feeding off my terror. As the figure reached out toward me, the storm outside intensified, the wind howling like a banshee. Just as their hand grazed my arm, the door flew open with a deafening bang, and the wind rushed in, pulling the figure back into the shadows. I didn't hesitate. I bolted out of the shelter, stumbling into the rain-soaked yard. The storm was still raging, but I didn't care. I ran as fast as I could back to the house, not daring to look back. Once inside, I locked the doors and collapsed onto the floor, my chest heaving with exhaustion. The storm continued through the night, but I never went back to that shelter. I couldn't. Whatever was down there wasn't human, and I knew it would be waiting for me if I ever returned. Even now, when the storms come, I can't help but think of that night, the cold, haunting presence in the shelter, and the terrifying realization that I was never alone. Moving into the old farmhouse felt like a dream come true. My partner and I had been looking for a quiet place in the countryside where we could escape the hustle and bustle of city life, and this house, surrounded by fields and trees, was perfect. It had that rustic charm, with creaky floors and a fireplace that filled the home with warmth. The first few nights were peaceful, filled with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. But soon, things started to change. It began with little things. At first, I noticed small objects, like a spoon or a book, weren't where we had left them. My partner joked that we were just getting used to the house, that it had a way of hiding things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was an eerie air around the place, especially at night. The quiet that we once found peaceful began to feel oppressive, like the silence was hiding something we couldn't see. A week later, the strange noises began. Late at night, I'd hear faint creaks, as if someone was walking around the house. At first, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. It was old, after all. But the noises grew louder, more deliberate, like footsteps. One night, we both woke up to the sound of something dragging across the floor downstairs. My partner grabbed a flashlight, and we crept through the house, hearts pounding. But when we got downstairs, everything was in place. The unsettling feeling lingered. Things escalated quickly after that. One night, I woke up to a strange sensation, like someone was watching me. The room was pitch dark, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I reached out to my partner, but before I could say anything, I saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the foot of our bed. My heart stopped. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but it was still there, unmoving. I grabbed my partner's arm, shaking them awake, but by the time the light was on, the figure was gone. That was when we realized we weren't alone in the house. The next morning, we found muddy footprints leading from the back door to the stairs. Someone had been inside. Fear gripped us both, but we tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, maybe someone was messing with us. We checked the locks, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, and every creak in the house sent shivers down my spine. A few nights later, everything came to a head. We were asleep when a loud crash from downstairs jolted us awake. This time, it wasn't just a noise, it was the sound of something breaking. My heart raced as we jumped out of bed, adrenaline coursing through us. My partner grabbed a bat, and we slowly made our way downstairs. The living room was dark, but in the dim light, we could see the front door wide open, the wind howling through it. As we turned to check the rest of the house, I felt a cold chill behind me. I spun around just in time to see him, the intruder. He was standing in the hallway, staring at us with a blank, emotionless expression. His clothes were dirty, and his eyes were hollow, like he'd been hiding in the house for days. My partner yelled for him to leave, brandishing the bat, but the man didn't move. It was as if he didn't even hear us. He just stood there, watching, as if waiting for something. The tension was unbearable, and in a split second, the intruder lunged at us. My partner swung the bat, narrowly missing him, and we both bolted for the back door. I could hear him chasing us, his footsteps heavy and frantic. We barely made it outside, slamming the door behind us and running toward the car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, and we peeled out of the driveway, leaving the farmhouse and the intruder behind. We didn't stop driving until we reached a nearby town, where we called the police. They searched the house but found no sign of the man. Whoever he was, he had disappeared without a trace. The only evidence left behind were the muddy footprints that led from the back of the house to our bedroom door. The police told us that it looked like he had been living in the house, hiding in the walls or the attic, watching us while we slept. We never went back to the farmhouse. The peaceful countryside home we'd dreamed of had turned into a nightmare. Even now, the thought of someone watching us while we slept, lurking in the shadows, fills me with dread. We moved back to the city, where the noise and chaos feel safer than the eerie silence of that old house. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can still feel those hollow eyes watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. After a long day on the road, I was exhausted and desperate for a place to rest. The sun had already set, and I had been driving for hours through unfamiliar back roads. When I saw the old roadside motel, its flickering neon sign offering vacancy, I decided it was as good a place as any to stop for the night. The building looked run down, but I didn't care. I just wanted to sleep. If I had known what was coming, I would have kept driving. The woman at the front desk barely glanced up as I checked in, her expression as tired and weathered as the motel itself. She handed me the key to room 7, and I made my way down the dimly lit corridor. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, and the flickering lights cast eerie shadows along the hallway. I chalked it up to my exhaustion. After all, a rundown motel wasn't exactly going to feel inviting. When I unlocked the door to my room, a strange sense of unease crept over me. The room was small and stale, with peeling wallpaper and an old bed that looked like it hadn't been used in years. As I set my bag down, I noticed the window was open just a crack, letting in a draft. I closed it, not thinking much of it at the time, but the air in the room still felt wrong. There was a heaviness to it, as if something unseen was pressing down on me. I tried to shake off the eerie feeling and got ready for bed. But sleep didn't come easily. The room was too quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Then, in the dead of night, I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the wall behind the bed. I sat up, my heart racing, straining to hear. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like something or someone was trapped just on the other side. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. That's when I heard the voice, a whisper so soft it sent chills down my spine. "Let me out." I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The whispering continued, low and haunting, coming from within the walls. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, maybe an old pipe groaning in the night, but deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right about this room. Panicked, I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, determined to leave the motel and never look back. But when I opened the door, the hallway outside was completely different. The lights had gone out, and the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. My heart pounded as I realized I was trapped. No matter how far I walked, the hallway kept going, the door to the motel lobby always just out of reach. I turned back, thinking I could return to my room, but the number on the door had changed. Room 7 was gone, replaced by a different number, 13. I tried the door anyway, and to my horror, it opened. Inside, the room was identical to the one I had just left, but there was something different. The bed was rumpled, as if someone had just been lying there, and the window was open again, letting in a cold breeze. It felt like a twisted version of the room I had been in before, as if the motel was playing tricks on me. Desperate, I tried to leave again, but the hallway twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. Every door I opened led to the same room, no matter how many times I tried. The whispers grew louder, filling the air around me, and I could feel a presence closing in. The walls seemed to pulse with life, as if the motel itself was watching, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I couldn't escape. In a moment of sheer panic, I ran for the window, hoping to jump out and make a break for it. But when I opened the curtains, I saw nothing but darkness, an endless void where the outside world should have been. I was completely trapped, caught in some kind of nightmare that I couldn't wake from. The whispers turned to laughter, chilling and eerie, and I knew I was no longer alone in the room. I spent what felt like hours, maybe even days, wandering through the endless maze of hallways and rooms, trying to find a way out. But every time I thought I had found the exit, I ended up right back where I started. The motel had swallowed me whole, and there was no escaping it. The voices in the walls taunted me, their words growing more frantic, more desperate, as if they were trying to pull me into the darkness with them. Finally, I collapsed in one of the identical rooms, exhausted and broken. The whispers had grown quiet, replaced by an eerie silence that filled the space. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, knowing that if I opened it again, I would just find another hallway, another room. The motel had trapped me in a loop, and there was no way out. I had become part of whatever haunted this place. I don't know how long I've been here. Days, weeks, months? Time doesn't seem to matter anymore. Every time I wake up, I'm still in the same room, the same hallway, with no escape in sight. The whispers come and go, sometimes loud, sometimes faint, but always there, always watching. I realize now that I was never meant to leave. This motel was my final destination, and I'll be trapped here forever. Exploring caves had always been a passion of mine. There was something exhilarating about the unknown, the thrill of venturing deep into the earth where few people had ever gone before. So when a group of friends invited me on an expedition to explore a newly discovered cave system, I couldn't say no. We were all experienced spelunkers, but this cave was uncharted territory, and the excitement was palpable as we gathered our gear and descended into the darkness. The entrance to the cave was narrow, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through one by one. The air inside was cool and damp, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the tunnels. Our headlamps cast eerie shadows on the walls as we navigated the twisting passages, the darkness pressing in from all sides. It was thrilling at first, each turn revealing new chambers and hidden corners. But the deeper we went, the more unsettling the cave became. After hours of exploring, we stumbled upon a massive chamber, its walls covered in strange, ancient markings. None of us had seen anything like it before. The symbols were crude, almost primal, and they seemed to pulse faintly in the light of our headlamps. One of my friends joked that we'd found some kind of ancient tomb, but the atmosphere in the cave had shifted. The air felt heavier, and there was an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. That's when the cave-in happened. Without warning, the ground shook and rocks began to fall from the ceiling. We scrambled for cover, but the entrance to the chamber collapsed, trapping us inside. Panic set in as we realized there was no way back. We were trapped deep underground, with no signal to call for help. The only option was to press forward, hoping to find another way out. But as we ventured deeper into the cave, something began to feel terribly wrong. The further we went, the more disoriented we became. The tunnels seemed to twist and turn in impossible ways, and every path we took felt like it was leading us in circles. Our headlamps flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. My heart raced as I realized we weren't just lost, something was watching us. I could feel it, lurking just beyond the reach of our lights, a presence that sent chills down my spine. Then we heard it, a faint, guttural growl that echoed through the cave. At first, we thought it might be an animal, but the sound was unlike anything we'd ever heard before. It was deep and resonant, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, and we picked up our pace, moving faster through the tunnels. But the growling followed us, growing louder, more menacing, as if whatever was in the cave was hunting us. As we ventured deeper, the ancient markings on the walls became more frequent, more elaborate. They seemed to tell a story, a warning of some kind, but we couldn't decipher their meaning. The growling continued, now accompanied by the sound of footsteps echoing through the cave. We weren't alone anymore, and whatever was down there with us was getting closer. The darkness felt alive, like it was closing in around us, suffocating. We reached another chamber, this one larger than the last, but it wasn't empty. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, covered in bones and strange artifacts. The sight sent a wave of fear through me. This wasn't just a cave, it was a place of ritual, a place where something ancient and terrible had been worshipped. The air was thick with a sense of dread, and the growling was louder now, almost deafening. That's when we saw it. A figure emerging from the shadows, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it had been waiting for us. My heart pounded in my chest as we backed away, but there was nowhere to go. We were trapped, and the creature was blocking our only exit. Panic set in, and we ran, desperate to escape. But the cave twisted and turned, and no matter which way we went, we always ended up back in the same chamber. The creature followed, its growls growing louder, more menacing. It was playing with us, toying with our fear. My friends were frantic, shouting, trying to find a way out. But the cave seemed to shift around us, trapping us in an endless loop. One by one, my friends disappeared into the darkness, their screams echoing through the cave. I was alone now, my headlamp flickering as the creature's growls grew louder, closer. The ancient markings on the walls seemed to pulse, glowing faintly as if the cave itself was alive, feeding off our fear. I stumbled through the tunnels, my heart racing, but every path led back to the chamber, to the altar, to the creature. Finally, I collapsed in the darkness, my body trembling with exhaustion and terror. The growling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that filled the cave. I could feel the creature's eyes on me, watching, waiting. There was no way out. The cave had claimed us, and whatever ancient force lurked within its depths had won. All I could do was wait, knowing that I would never see the light of day again. I never imagined taking a security job at an abandoned shopping mall would be anything more than boring. The place had been closed for years, left to rot in the middle of nowhere. The company that owned it was paranoid about break-ins, even though no one in their right mind would want anything from there. Still, it was an easy gig, and I figured it would be a few quiet nights of walking empty corridors. But from the moment I stepped inside, the place felt wrong. The mall was enormous, the kind that had once been bustling with families, kids running from store to store. But now, it was a ghost town. The once glamorous storefronts were boarded up or shattered, and every step I took echoed unnervingly in the cavernous space. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the faded tiles. The air was thick with dust, and the place had a musty, forgotten smell. Something about it gave me a chill, but I brushed it off. It was just an old building, after all. My first few rounds were uneventful, exactly what I expected. I walked the length of the mall, passing the skeletal remains of what had once been food courts and department stores. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet. By midnight, I found myself checking my watch every few minutes, counting the hours until my shift was over. As I was passing the empty movie theater, I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the echo of my own steps, but then I realized these footsteps were behind me, out of sync with mine. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the dark corridor behind me, but there was no one there. My heart raced, and I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, this place was huge and creepy. My mind was playing tricks on me, but the footsteps started again. This time faster, more deliberate. I turned again, but once more, the corridor was empty. A sense of unease settled over me, and for the first time that night, I felt like I wasn't alone. I tried to shake it off and continued my rounds, but the further I went, the more unsettling things became. I started hearing faint voices, whispers that echoed through the empty halls. At first, they were barely audible, but they grew louder as the night wore on. The worst part? I couldn't understand a word they were saying. It was just garbled, eerie murmuring that sent shivers down my spine. Every time I stopped to listen, the whispers would fade, leaving only the oppressive silence. I turned to run, but the breathing followed me, growing louder, closer. My footsteps echoed off the walls as I sprinted down the corridor, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel something behind me, something inhuman, its presence heavy and suffocating. I ran through the mall, trying door after door, but everyone was locked. The breathing never stopped, and no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't outrun it. Finally, I found a side exit and burst through it, collapsing into the parking lot. I gasped for air, my entire body trembling with fear. The mall stood behind me, dark and silent, but I knew I'd never go back. Whatever was in there wasn't human, and it wasn't going to let me leave alive if I stayed another minute. I quit the job the next day, but the experience still haunts me. Even now, when I drive past the abandoned mall, I can feel its eerie presence. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I know one thing for sure: that place is not empty. Something still lives there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. In the small coastal town where I grew up, we had an old legend passed down through generations, a mysterious fog that rolled in from the sea every few years. People whispered about it, calling it the death fog. According to the stories, anyone who ventured outside when the fog came never returned. Most of the town considered it an old wives' tale, something to scare children into staying indoors. But I knew better. I had seen the fear in the eyes of the older folks whenever the fog was mentioned. They knew something we didn't. One evening, I was at a friend's house when the fog started to roll in. It was thicker than any fog I'd ever seen, turning the streets into a wall of gray. I remembered the stories, but I was older now, and like most, I didn't believe in the legends anymore. We laughed it off, thinking it was just another foggy night by the sea. But as the fog grew thicker, the laughter died down. There was something different about this fog, something chilling. From the window, I could barely see the street lamp, just a few feet away, its light swallowed by the eerie mist. The town seemed unnervingly quiet, the usual sounds of the ocean and distant traffic muted, as if the fog had absorbed everything. Then we heard it, a faint knock on the door. At first, we thought it was one of our friends playing a prank, but when we opened the door, no one was there, just the dense fog swirling in the street. That's when the fear started to creep in. As we stood by the door, peering into the mist, we saw something move, shadows faint but unmistakable, drifting in and out of the fog. At first they seemed far off, but then they drew closer. There were no distinct features, just dark, human-like shapes, barely visible but terrifyingly real. We slammed the door shut, hearts pounding, trying to convince ourselves it was just our imagination. But the fog was relentless, pressing against the windows, the shadows within it moving closer. By now, the town's legend was all I could think about. The death fog. I had always assumed it was just a ghost story, but there was no denying what we were seeing. The knocking came again, louder this time, from every window and door, as if whatever was outside wanted to come in. My friends and I huddled together, unsure of what to do. There was no power, no cell service, and the fog made it impossible to see beyond a few feet. We were trapped. Then the whispers started. Faint at first, just like the knocking, but growing louder with every passing minute. It was as if the fog itself was speaking, calling out to us. We pressed ourselves against the walls, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The voices were everywhere, surrounding us, their words unintelligible, but filled with a haunting tone that chilled me to the bone. I could feel the weight of something dark and malevolent closing in. One of my friends, panicked beyond reason, decided to make a run for it. He thought he could outrun the fog, make it to his car, and drive away. We tried to stop him, but before we could, he threw open the door and sprinted into the mist. We watched, helpless, as his figure disappeared into the gray. His footsteps echoed for a moment, then nothing, just silence. We called out for him, but there was no response. He was gone. Terrified, we barricaded ourselves inside the house, pulling furniture against the doors and windows. The shadows outside grew more distinct, moving in jerky, unnatural motions, as if they weren't human at all. The whispers turned into low, guttural growls, and every so often there'd be a thud against the house, as if something was trying to break in. We were running out of options, and our fear was mounting with each passing second. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to lose meaning in that fog. Every moment felt like an eternity, the oppressive air making it hard to breathe. I couldn't shake the feeling that the fog was alive, a sentient force feeding off our terror. The walls of the house groaned under the weight of it, and the temperature seemed to drop. We were freezing, our breaths visible in the air, even though it was summer. Suddenly the fog shifted. It wasn't retreating, it was condensing. The shadows outside the windows grew denser, their forms more solid, and then the door handle began to turn slowly. My heart nearly stopped. We grabbed whatever we could find, chairs, broken lamps, ready to fight off whatever was coming for us. But just as the door cracked open, the fog began to dissipate. The whispers faded and the shapes melted back into the mist. When the sun finally rose, the fog was gone. We stepped outside cautiously, the town eerily quiet and still. The streets were empty, but not everyone had been as lucky as us. We found cars with doors left open, homes with lights still on, but no sign of the people who had once filled them. It was as if they had vanished, swallowed by the fog. My friend who had run into the mist was never seen again. Since that night, I can't look at fog the same way. Whenever it rolls in from the sea, I stay indoors, no matter how harmless it seems. The town's legend may have been dismissed by many, but I know the truth now. The fog that brings death is real, and it will return again, waiting to claim its next victims. For years, old Mr. Daniels was the cemetery keeper in our small town. He lived in a modest house right by the gates, keeping watch over the rows of weathered headstones and ancient crypts. People said he'd been there longer than anyone could remember, almost as if he'd always been a part of the graveyard itself. As kids, we'd make up ghost stories about him, claiming he was a spirit, cursed to guard the cemetery for eternity. But, like most things, it was just a story, until I started working for him one summer. I took the job to earn some extra cash, helping with maintenance, cutting the grass, fixing fences, and keeping things tidy. It seemed easy enough, and Mr. Daniels wasn't much for conversation. He mostly kept to himself, wandering among the graves with a faraway look in his eyes. There was something eerie about the way he moved, like he was familiar with every inch of the cemetery. He would sometimes stop at certain graves, just staring down at them for long stretches, mumbling under his breath. It was unsettling, but I figured it was just the quirks of an old man who had spent too much time around the dead. One evening, as I was packing up my tools, Mr. Daniels approached me. His face was pale, and his eyes had that haunted look again. He told me I needed to be careful, especially after dark. "The spirits here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "They don't always stay where they're buried." I chuckled nervously, thinking he was just trying to spook me. But he wasn't laughing. He looked deadly serious. That night was the first time I began to feel like maybe the stories weren't just rumors. The next few nights were strange. As I worked later into the evening, I started to notice things. Shadows moving between the headstones, even though there was no wind. I'd hear soft whispers, like a breeze stirring the grass. But when I stopped to listen, the sound would vanish. The air grew cold after sunset, colder than it had any right to be in the middle of summer. The worst part was the feeling, like I was being watched, followed by unseen eyes that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. One night, I stayed later than usual, helping Mr. Daniels lock up the gates. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the cemetery took on an entirely different atmosphere. The headstones cast long, eerie shadows, and the crypts loomed like dark sentinels guarding the dead. We were just about to finish when I heard it, a faint rustling, like someone moving through the tall grass. I turned to Mr. Daniels, expecting him to explain it away, but his face had gone pale. "They're waking up," he whispered. Before I could ask what he meant, I saw it. At first it was just a shape, faint and wispy, moving between the graves. Then more shapes appeared, drifting slowly, their forms hazy and translucent. My heart raced as I realized I was seeing spirits. their ghostly figures wandering the cemetery as if they had unfinished business. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. Mr. Daniels grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong for an old man. "Don't run," he warned. "That's what they want." We backed away slowly, but the spirits seemed to sense us. Their ghostly forms began to turn, their hollow eyes locking onto us with a chilling intensity. Mr. Daniels muttered something under his breath, an old prayer or chant, I couldn't tell. The air around us grew thick, the temperature dropping rapidly. The spirits were drawing closer, and I could feel their cold presence pressing against my skin. It was like they were trying to pull me into the grave with them. Suddenly, Mr. Daniels collapsed, clutching his chest. I rushed to help him, but as I bent down, I felt something icy wrap around my ankle. I looked down and saw a skeletal hand emerging from the ground, gripping me with unnatural strength. Panic surged through me as I tried to shake it off, but the grip tightened, pulling me toward the earth. I screamed for help, but the cemetery was silent except for the faint whispers of the dead. With all my strength, I kicked the hand away and scrambled to my feet, dragging Mr. Daniels with me. The spirits were all around us now, their ghostly forms swirling in the air like a storm of death. The graveyard felt alive, and I knew we had to get out. Together, we stumbled toward the gate, the spirits following close behind, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Just as we reached the gate, the air grew still, and the spirits vanished as if they had never been there. Mr. Daniels slumped against the fence, breathing heavily. "They almost got us this time," he muttered. He looked at me with haunted eyes and said, "This is the curse. The dead won't leave me alone. They're waiting for me to join them." He explained that years ago he had taken something from the cemetery, an artifact from one of the graves. Since then, the spirits had been restless, waiting for the day they could drag him underground. Now they wanted me too. I quit the job the next day, but the nightmares never stopped. I dream of the cemetery often, of cold hands pulling me into the earth, of ghostly whispers calling my name. And sometimes, when I pass by the cemetery at night, I swear I can still see Mr. Daniels wandering among the graves, keeping watch over the restless dead.